guess we
All
can
right.
start.
Absolutely. Hello. And here we are starting. Welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today we have a very special treat, something I'm actually really excited about doing because I have my guest, Richard Schoenig, on the show. So, first of all, hello, Richard. How are you?
Fine, and glad to be here, Dale.
Excellent. And yeah, Richard, believe it or not, I've been working behind the scenes, as some of the audience might know, with another atheist or skeptic, Keith Augustine, about coming on my show to do share their expertise on near-death experiences with a couple of other experts. But that show had to be rescheduled for a future month. But Keith was kind enough to recommend my show to Richard Schoenig for him to come on and share his knowledge for us to have kind of a discussion about Christianity as a whole and his book, Where Christianity Errs, a fair and clear philosophical assessment. So that's the plan for today. We're going to kind of alternate and try to do at least 2 or 3 topics both for and against the truth of Christianity. But before we get into it, Richard, you're new to the show, so I just want to give you a chance to introduce yourself to the audience, maybe tell us about your background, and maybe share a little bit about your faith or your religious faith journey, if you want to share that.
Well, sure. I was, for the most part, born and raised in Bergenfield, New Jersey, which is a suburb of New York City. I was born into a Catholic family, and I was raised Catholic, attended Catholic schools from kindergarten through PhD, and I was quite an observant and knowledgeable Catholic, as it turns out. I I received a Bachelor of Science degree from Fordham University in the Bronx, which is a Catholic Jesuit school, and a PhD in organic chemistry from the University of Notre Dame in South Bend. After a 2-year stint as an officer in the Corps of Engineers, due to an ROTC commitment, I earned a master's and a PhD in philosophy from Indiana University, Bloomington. I published in a variety of chemistry and philosophy journals, but mostly the latter, since I've long since left my chemistry career behind me. I've written popular articles for magazines such as Free Inquiry, The Humanist, The American Rationalist, Secular World, and most recently, of course, I'm happy to have published my book on Where Christianity Errs, a fair and clear philosophical assessment with the subtitle. Let's see. When I'm not trying to figure out the meaning of life, I can be found grousing about politics, playing Scrabble, doing crossword puzzles, rooting for the San Antonio Spurs basketball team, working on physical fitness, and enjoying the Davis Mountains of West Texas and the Rocky Mountains of southwestern Colorado. Now, I would add, in terms of my religious odyssey, as I said, I was born and raised a Catholic and was an observant Catholic. I think the best way to sum it up is I started out, in a sense, as a conservative Catholic, and then without drama or trauma, I slowly migrated to moderate Catholic, then to liberal Catholic, and then eventually I'm not sure what. And then by the time I was in my early 30s, I pretty much realized that if I'm going to be accurate, I'm going to take on the mantle of atheism. So that was how that journey took. It was not catalyzed by any traumatic event or something like that. I wasn't abused by priests, or I didn't leave angrily, I guess you'd say, and I'm still not angry about it. I just think that the view that I have now is the best one that fits the evidence that I have, and I always keep in mind I could be wrong, and I'm always ready to change my mind if the evidence does require that. So I think that yes, actually, how did I earn my living? Well, I was teaching philosophy at San Antonio College here in San Antonio, Texas, until I retired in 2020. And so I had very good memories of lots of good students that I taught, and it was very satisfying. So I think that pretty much wraps it up.
Excellent. So you've got a double doctorate. You've got one in science kind of thing, organic chemistry, I think you said, and in my field, philosophy. So that's great. You fit right in here. So yeah,
Okay.
thank you. Awesome.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being willing to come on. So at this point, we're going to alternate. So I think, Richard, you're going to take the very first topic segment that you want to discuss. This is the first argument against the truth of Christianity. So I think it was chapter 1 in your book. So over to you to give your opening presentation for that argument.
Well, okay, I've actually switched up a little bit, Dale. I'm not adding anything new. The order is different. I'm actually going to start with some problems that I see with the Christian salvation doctrine, or salvific as it's sometimes used.
Gotcha.
And that would be chapter 15 in Where Christianity Errs. This will, of course, of necessity be an abridgment of that, but the full treatment will be found there. Okay, so I hope everyone can see the screen.
Yep, I've got it full screen for you.
Good. I'm going to start out with a little bit of a preamble and make the observation that there is no complete agreement among Christians on what are the necessary requirements for salvation. Some of the proposed requirements include, some will say, being baptized, placing conscious personal faith in Jesus, accepting him as your Savior, doing good works, making use of the sacraments, and there might be others as well. But I just want to note this here because I'll make reference to this at a later point. Okay, here's the argument that I want to put forth, and I call it the argument for God's non-existence from the existence of unfair salvific, meaning having to do with salvation opportunities. Now that's quite a mouthful, so I'll abbreviate that with the acronym AUSO, Argument Unfair Salvific Opportunities. And here's the argument laid out in syllogistic form with premises and conclusions. A conclusion. The premise, of course, are the evidence statements. So premise 1 says, if God exists, there would be no unfair salvific opportunities for humans. Premise 2, there are unfair salvific opportunities for humans. Conclusion, therefore God does not exist. Now, I think it's pretty uncontroversial that this is what logicians call a valid argument, meaning that if the two premises are true or assumed to be true, then the conclusion will logically follow. Well, clearly this isn't the gold standard. What we want is a sound argument, and logicians will say a sound argument is one that is both valid, which I think this one is without a doubt, and here's the more important point for us now, the premises have to be true. All right, if it's going to be a sound argument. Well, I think premise 1 is not controversial. The way Christians define God, among his characteristics or properties, he's omnibenevolent, he's all good. And so unfairness would not be something that an all good being would entertain. So premise 1, I don't think is controversial. Premise 2 is controversial, of course. This is where the differences arise between the atheist and the Christian. By the way, when I talk about God here and pretty much for the rest of this presentation today, I'm basically talking about the Christian God, unless I say otherwise. But I won't keep saying if the Christian God, etc. It's just easier to say God. All right. So I've highlighted premise 2, because since I am giving this argument, I have the burden of proof. I have to show that premise 2 is true, and if I can't show it, then this argument is not sound and the conclusion doesn't follow. So the rest of my presentation here essentially is going to be designed to show that premise 2 is in fact something that has sufficient evidence to it. Now I'm going to split my screen here for a second. So let's see here. Leave it on view, and then let's see.
You're trying to show like two documents at once or something, or
yeah, exactly. View. Oh, maybe it's already split. That's why I won't do it. Maybe it's down. Yeah, here it is. Okay. All right. So I keep the premise 2 up there so people can see it, and then I will proceed to try to defend the truth of that premise. The core of my defense of premise 2 is rooted in some recently published scientific numerical data about human reproduction. That is to say, a number of research teams around the world in the last 2 decades or so have been studying human reproduction, and some of the results that they have come up with are quite interesting and relate to my defense of premise 2. What I'm going to do here is quote from one of the researchers, and that is Dr. Catherine Cavanaugh, as you can see, Associate Professor of Biology at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. And she says, and I quote, "In people, the most common outcome of reproduction by far is embryo loss due to random genetic errors. An estimated 70 to 75% of human conceptions fail to survive to birth. That number includes both embryos that are reabsorbed into the parent's body before anyone knows an egg has been fertilized, and miscarriages that happen later in the pregnancy," unquote. All right, so that's quite an interesting and, to my mind, startling piece of scientific data. Now, I'm going to use the intermediate figure of 72%. They quoted 70 to 75, but I'll pick something in between because it's easier to work with. So the intermediate figure is 72% for the percentage of human conceptions that fail to survive to birth, and of course then 28% for the percentage that do survive to be born alive. All right. Now, the way I'm going to connect those numbers with the defense of premise 2 is found on this slide here, which I call Christian salvation by the numbers. And I'm actually going to start down here with 117 billion. This is the number of humans that professional demographers say, more or less, it's an estimate, but it's a fairly accurate one in their eyes, of how many humans have been born alive in the roughly 300,000 year history of our species. Okay, so 117 billion. But from the research that I just described, this 117 billion represents only 28% of all the human conceptions there have been. And so if you do the arithmetic, that turns out to be then 418 billion human conceptions / persons who have existed. Now, I say conceptions / persons. The reason I say persons here is because most denominations within Christianity maintain that personhood begins at the moment of conception, when God associates a soul with the fertilized egg. So that means now we've got 418 billion persons who have ever lived. Again, more or less, but not much more or much less. 28% of them, or 117 billion, were born alive. 72%, or 301 billion of them, died in utero. Now, here's where I start trying to connect this with premise 2. I contend that the 301 billion who died in utero have to be considered unsaved. And the reason is, if you recall, I gave those 4 different requirements or possible requirements for salvation. Being baptized, accepting Jesus as your Savior, doing good works, using the sacraments. None of those could be accomplished or satisfied by the 301 billion who died in utero. And consequently, they have to be considered unsaved. If they are unsaved, then second, I would think it's pretty evident that that's unfair for a number of reasons. First of all, the 117 billion over here who were born alive, they at least have a chance to be saved. Whether they are or not, that's another question, and we can deal with that in a minute. But right now, once they're born, they're in the game, as it were. The 301 billion, they're out of the game. They can't be saved, and I say it's unfair because the 301 billion didn't do anything to warrant their dying in utero. They didn't bring it on themselves with any sort of bad choice or immoral activity. And so, in that sense, it's unfair that they ended up here. And it's kind of ironic because, in a sense, they are just brought into existence by the laws, the physical laws of this universe. And they die in utero by the physical laws of this universe. And of course, it is, according to Christians, it is God who set out these laws. So in a sense, God knew in advance these 301 billion weren't ever going to be saved, and yet he went ahead and saved them anyway, created them anyway. That there's an element of unfairness there, I think. Now, I feel that I could stop right now and say, I'm satisfied in premise 2. All I really needed minimally is to show there's one person who suffered unfair salvific opportunities. I think I've shown that there are somewhere in the vicinity of 301 billion persons, 72% of all who have ever lived. But as they say, wait, there's more. Let's take a look, go back to this 117 billion and see what their fate is with respect to premise 2. I think we can usefully divide them into 2 camps. On the one hand, 55 billion humans, demographers tell us, lived before the Christian message was introduced into history. And I take that to be the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era. This 55 billion, I think, will also have to be considered unsaved for a similar reason. They lived before the requirements for salvation were given, and even before the Christian.
Oh, sorry, you cut out. You kind of paused there for a little bit. Do you want to just repeat the last few seconds of what you said?
Okay, yeah. The 55 billion have to be considered unsaved because they lived before the Christian God was introduced into the world and his requirements were given for salvation. In other words, the 55 billion didn't know about God or the requirements that they had to accomplish to be saved. So they're going to live and die without satisfying those requirements, and I think that allows us to say they are going to have to be considered unsaved. And so that 55 billion then has to be added to the 301 billion. Now we're up to 356 billion, and the 13% added to the 72%. So now 85%, 356 billion people have to be considered unsaved. I would also argue that the 55 billion are unfairly unsaved because, once again, they did nothing to warrant being born when they were born, what time in history they were born. And so that basically seems to be unfair that they should be excluded from salvation just simply because of that accident of birth. All right. Now let's look at the 62 billion who lived after the Christian salvific message was given to history. I think we can safely divide them into two groups. About 30 billion of them, I think, I estimate, could be said to have never heard the salvific message, even though it was around somewhere in the world. And they never heard it because the salvific message never reached them where they live. So consider 1,500 years after the introduction of Christianity into the world, so the year 1500, basically few, if any, people in North America, South America, Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Islands, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, where India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, Southeast Asia, etc., had heard of Jesus or the salvific message, and consequently they never could satisfy the requirements, never having heard them. So they have to be considered unsaved. And so we add another 30 billion, and we're now up to 386 billion. And we add 7% more, we're now up to 92% of all people who have ever lived. And by the way, this 30 billion, they have to be considered unfairly unsaved, because we can't expect that they would have satisfied requirements that they never heard. Okay, so what's left? Well, we've got 20 billion over here who represent people who lived after the Christian message was introduced into the world, and but they are unsaved, and the reason for that is they either died before reaching the age of accountability, or they had severe cognitive handicaps, or they heard a flawed version of the salvific message, or an incomplete version, or finally they were people who heard the proper message, understood it, but honestly reasoned in their own mind that the salvific message was implausible. So this would be atheists, agnostics, and maybe some members of other religions. So this 20 billion then, I think, could be said to be unfairly unsaved. After all, for example, people who die before the age of accountability or have severe cognitive handicaps couldn't give a responsible response to the requirements, even if they heard them. So this is another 20 billion and another 5%. And at this point now, we're up to something like 406 billion, or 97% of all people who have ever lived have to be considered unfairly unsaved. That leaves 12 billion over here who presumably are saved because they didn't die in utero, they didn't die before the salvific message was given, they didn't live in a place where the salvific message never reached, and none of the characteristics in this category apply to them. So they can be considered saved, and they represent 3% of all the people who've ever lived. Although I do give you a caveat here, the actual number is probably going to be lower, because clearly, as we know, some people, even those who accept the requirements, will backslide or give up the faith or apostatize or something like that. But I won't worry about that. Let's just give the Christian the 3%, 12 billion. So here's the summary then. The total number of unsaved, 301 billion. Why? They died in utero. Couldn't satisfy the requirements. 55 billion lived before the Christian message was given in the world. Couldn't satisfy the message. They have to be considered unsaved. 30 billion or so lived where the message never arrived. They have to be considered unsaved. 20 billion, for a variety of reasons, also have to be considered unsaved, for a grand total of 406 billion out of 418 billion who ever lived. So that's 97% of all humans who have ever lived have to be considered unsaved. And then 12 billion, or 3%, saved. So let me go back and finish off then the assessment of the argument here. Remember, I had the burden of proof of showing that premise 2 is true. I think I've discharged that burden. And if so, then this premise is true. This one is true, premise 1. The fact that this is a valid argument says that if these premises are true, we can be sure that the conclusion follows logically. And we just didn't assume these premises are true, but I argued for them. And so true premises and this conclusion, this is, I argue, a sound argument, and it leads to the conclusion that God or the Christian God does not exist. Okay, sorry for that. By the way, Dale, this is the longest presentation. The other two are under 10 minutes. This one is a little bit longer, and I'm sorry I took up the time.
That's not a problem. No, I'm actually loving your organization. I think this is really well presented. So yeah, go ahead and take your time and just let me know. I'll come in when you're ready. So.
Yeah, I'm finished.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, just kind of my reaction to it. Like I said, this was really well done, and really well organized and presented. So thank you for putting in this hard work to present a well organized argument. So the first thing, by assessment, I guess we'll discuss this bit by bit. So the first thing is, you're absolutely correct. This is valid. This is a modus tollens, or denying the consequent argument, which is valid. The question is it logically sound or not? And first thing I want to do, believe it or not, even though I think I accept the premise 1, just to clarify, two things on premise 1. First is a clarifying question. By salvific opportunity, and I think this bears out between your distinction between saved and not saved. As long as someone gets saved before the point of no return, whatever that is, like whatever, it's not like God has to reveal the truth to them as early as possible. No, as long, maybe if they find out that Christianity is true at the age of 70 and then they die 71, that is good. God met his obligation, correct?
I'm not sure I'm following here. Basically, are you proposing a form of like Calvinism where there are no opportunities for salvation? It's just what God elects. Who he elects is that?
So not yet. That was gonna be where I was gonna ask you about challenge premise 1 next. But I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. Like, the only thing you care about in your argument is whether they're saved or not. It's not about the timing of when they receive salvation. Okay. That's irrelevant to your argument. Okay. Uh-huh. Okay, so my first challenge, and this, I don't believe in this personally, but there are Calvinists who would challenge premise 1, and they would say, why wouldn't there be any unfair salvific opportunities? It is up to God's will who he saves or not. So how would you respond to someone who raises that? Yeah.
I think that would bring us to a different area. I mean, as an atheist, then I would have to evaluate the notion of election itself and what sort of problems that might bring, and it would take us a little bit far off the track here. I mean, it's not just atheists who have problems with Calvinism. I think most other Christians too also. And the idea essentially is that if Calvinism is true, then God creates people simply to put them into hell. In other words, the ones he doesn't elect. And that does seem to strain the omnibenevolent part of his necessary properties. So I think I would pursue something along that line. And I think I would be probably have allies even within the Christian tradition as well.
Yep, and I would be one of them. So I do fully affirm premise 1. So it's correct. It does come down to premise 2, and I do disagree with your premise 2 that there are unfair salvific opportunities. So the first thing I would just want to say, I know this is one of your other topics, but I think that one of the problems with the argument is you are assuming the truth of the doctrine of original sin, whereas many Christians, perhaps even most Christians, would deny that doctrine. So for example, I think your first distinction, if I'm remembering it in the chart, was that 72% of babies die in the womb. And, so therefore you said, well, they were unsaved. But actually, I think most Christians would argue, no, they are saved. Like even your argument begins with, maybe, sorry, if you could just mute yourself when you're not talking, because the echo's really, really bad.
Okay, let me mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
All right, perfect. So yeah, that's, and even in your argument at one point, at a later point, you mentioned that there is this age of accountability. Well, that presumes that babies in the womb haven't met that age since they weren't born, and therefore they're not accountable. So they were saved. So yeah, that's the first kind of objection I would give at that distinction there. Why should we assume the original sin doctrine is true? And that therefore the unborn babies are guilty of a damnable sin or something. Oh, just unmute yourself. If you're talking,
yeah, can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good.
Let me try to put my volume down a little bit here. Maybe that will help. I don't know. But okay, I'll have to work with this. With respect to babies in the womb is over, I use the expression they are unsaved. That doesn't necessarily mean they're damned, and that may be one of the things that would be important to consider. For example, the Catholic Church, I was looking for this citation, I have it somewhere, but I can't find it. The Catholic Church basically says that baptism is necessary for salvation, and infants who die in utero like that, they're not damned. You may be familiar with the term limbo.
Yeah.
But the limbo is supposed to be a place not of punishment, but a place where people like these babies go, and they live a perfectly good existence there, except they don't have the beatific vision of God in heaven. And the response that I have is that, but wait a minute, that beatific vision, the summum bonum, the highest good, to be in an intimate relationship with God forever in heaven, is the maximally best post-mortem fate that you can have. And children who die in utero are, in fact, kept from having that, and that's unfair. I mean, they didn't do anything to merit dying in utero. So my argument doesn't depend on them being damned, but it does depend on them not getting the same kind of treatment that people who are in heaven are receiving. And the Orthodox Church, Eastern Orthodox, basically says something very similar. So, and I'm also about most Christians denying original sin. I know there are some who do that, but I don't know whether most is appropriate. For example, the Catholic Church represents 50% of all Christians, and it accepts original sin, as I believe does the Eastern Orthodox as well, another 12%. So you're right that there are some who want to reject it. And by the way, when we get to that presentation on original sin, I'll talk about why getting rid of original sin would be a difficult thing for Christianity to do, but I don't want to complicate this discussion with that right now.
Fair enough. So I take your point fully about, okay, so the distinction between being unsaved and damned. Okay, so I'll go with your point there. So they're being deprived of salvation, of a good type things. Well, okay, so just before I move on though, believe it or not, in terms of the Eastern Orthodox, they do deny original sin, but I'm just curious, would you admit that if the doctrine of original sin is false, if it is false, just for the sake of argument, then that would kind of defeat your argument, because then we would have no basis on which to assume these babies are being unsaved.
Um, if the doctrine of original sin is false, there's no reason why these babies are unsaved. I don't know. I hadn't thought about that. What do you think?
I think it is, because I think with the law, right? So there's two ways to be saved, right? You can live a morally perfect or sinless life, or you can get saved through Christ and the conditions for salvation on the cross and that sort of thing. At least in the Messianic era. So there are two ways, right? That's what I would say.
Well, living a morally sinless life, I thought St. Paul, among others, said that that's not possible. We are all sinners, and the fact that, of course, it's hard to say why, let's say, infants or those who die in utero are sinners. That's why original sin is sort of brought into the equation, because at least it gives cover to the contention that, and yes, we are all sinners, and therefore we can't attain salvation by ourselves. That's why the second person of the Trinity, God, has to incarnate and go through the passion and death and resurrection, etc., in order to free all of us from the bonds of sin that original sin has given us. So I'm thinking original sin is really important here.
Yeah, so I think I'll just come back, and I know we have a full topic on this, but I'll just come back very quickly on this before I move on to my second point here. But so I think what I would say is that I agree with you that Paul does say, for all have fallen short of the glory of God and that sort of thing, every human being, but it's not necessarily every human being at any given time, right? We're not officially a sinner until we commit an act of sin at the at the age of accountability type thing. So that's what I would say. I think that Paul is mentioning, you become a sinner once you do a sin, and every human being who grows to the age of accountability will in fact, and does in fact, commit a sin sooner or later, and therefore become a sinner.
Well, I mean, that's one interpretation, and Christianity is a big tent, and there are lots of different ways of parsing what Paul says or what anyone says, and that's one way you could try to go, I guess. But as I said, I think there are problems there with respect to the basics of the incarnation and the resurrection and the whole idea of Jesus' sacrifice to free us from sin. But
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So another objection I would give. So let's assume original sin is in fact true. Like, once you become or at least some version of it, like once the human being exists, the soul exists, it's a sinner and it's guilty of sin and stuff like that. Now, one thing I would say is, I think your second premise is assuming, and I believe this myself, but I would say, what evidence do you have that the soul is created upon conception? Because there are at least 4 different views within the early church and stuff like that. Origen had a view of the pre-existence of souls and stuff like that. So if you go for an alternative view, you could say that, well, technically speaking, maybe someone sinned before their conception physically or something like that, and that's why they would be unsaved if they died in the womb from sin. Or alternatively, William Hasker has argued for emergentism. So he would say, well, the soul isn't created until the physical body develops to a certain point. So why? Yeah, I think your argument, in order to work, has to assume that the soul is created upon conception, which I personally agree with, and I think it is the majority view. But why should we assume that? And if we assume a different view, wouldn't that be a problem?
That would certainly change the parameters, but the idea is one of the things that I have to work with. If the title of the book, "Where Christianity Errs," it kind of covers up an important point, namely that Christianity is, as I said just a moment ago, it's a big tent, and there's a lot of different ideas of what proper Christianity is, and I think you're right in the sense that if you pick and choose on certain aspects of what certain groups in Christianity say, you might be able to get around certain of the criticisms, etc. Of course, coming from the Catholic tradition, which is the majority tradition in Christianity, tend to feel that I've got something to work with here, because the Catholic Church, whatever else it may be or not be, it's got its house in order, I guess. That may be a virtue or it may be a vice. It's not as democratic and person to person as Protestantism is, but everybody knows where the Catholics stand. And so for Catholicism, the idea of ensoulment at conception is a given. And I think that fuels the objections that the Catholic Church has traditionally had in leading the fight against abortion, and abortion at any time. And I think they're joined by other areas of Christianity. Interestingly enough, the ones that are often opposing Catholicism for other reasons, such as the evangelical fundamentalists and such, they also accept the idea of ensoulment and personment at the same time. So I think that explains why I assumed that at the moment of conception a person is given. But even if it weren't, Dale, I think you still have the other areas to concern about what about the 55 billion who lived before the Christian message was given, and they didn't satisfy those requirements, and they would certainly be more than the one person I need to show salvific unfairness to. So I think there are fallback positions as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's a perfectly fair response. I guess my only thing I would just say, like, maybe just kind of tweak your arguments instead of like the Christian God, say like the Catholic God, or like the traditional mainstream Christian God or something like that, because you're absolutely right. Look, I'm an evangelical Baptist. I would call myself a fundamentalist in that I believe in the fundamentals, not the mischaracterization of it. But I also agree with you that the soul comes into creation upon conception. So no argument there, but I just wanted to raise that. So you do raise this next point, and this is my third and final thing that I think defeats your argument or this premise based on all the categorization, the rest of the categorizations, including the ones people born before the New Testament conditions were in. And so soteriologically, there are different positions that I think are warranted someone could take. So you're assuming an exclusivist understanding of salvation. Here are the conditions for salvation that you list out the four you think that they are. If you don't, you either meet them and you're saved, or you don't meet them and you're unsaved. I don't think that's what the Bible says. I mean, the Bible presupposes that the Old Testament saints are indeed saved and are in God's presence, even as Paul's writing. So I don't even think Catholics would agree with that. And I know for a fact they don't, because I just debated a Roman Catholic PhD scholar, Louis Dizon, and he said the Catholic Church adopts an inclusivist understanding of salvation, meaning these are the conditions under normal circumstances we are mostly responsible to meet them. And that, generally speaking, is the basis for saying saved or unsaved. But it can also include people who don't meet those conditions. through no fault of their own, and that would include the Old Testament saints. Abraham and Moses saved. I don't know any Christian who would deny that. They didn't have an explicit belief that Jesus raised from the dead or something like that. So, I'll just give this one verse and then I'll bring it back to you. But I think there's biblical support in Romans chapter 2, verses 15 to 16, which states, there are conflicting thoughts that Paul's talking about on Judgment Day, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or else excuse them on the day of judgment, when according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ. So this is kind of the biblical basis why we adopt an inclusivist understanding, whereby some people can be included despite not fulfilling the explicit conditions for salvation. Over to you.
Yeah, I think in the Catholic tradition, there's something that speaks to that, and that is something they call baptism by desire. And I suspect what one could say here is that those Old Testament individuals that you refer to, they lived before the full message was given, but they did accept the part of the message that had been given so far to humankind. And in that sense, they showed their bona fides. It just occurred to me that's actually more than just a figure of speech. Their good faith, and thereby they are given a pass, shall we say? And that wouldn't apply though to the other cases that I brought up. This is a very special case of sort of pre-Christian Christians, I guess you'd say. That may be one way to try to get around that.
Okay, so I guess I would just come back and say, well, why does it only apply to the Old Testament saints? Why couldn't we extend that to include people living in the New Testament era and thereafter, as Paul says in Romans chapter 2? I mean, so for example, you yourself, so kids that are born, right? You, in your own slides, you mentioned that there is this age of accountability. That can't just be a meaningless term. So that means there's an age at which you're accountable, right, versus to meet those conditions, versus before which you're not accountable. So is that something that you deliberately used? Was it just you were adopting terminology? Like, is there an age of accountability, and what is that, if there is?
Yeah, I think there is an age of accountability, and I don't even think it's a religious thing. There is a point at which children are, I think, justly held responsible for their behavior. And I don't know, the age that I've seen talked about is 7 or 8. I don't think it's specific, but it does exist. But the people, as I said, the 55 billion who lived before the Christian era, or the ones who died in utero, or the ones who never heard the message, and so on, the baptism by desire part is not going to work because they didn't even know about the Yahweh or God the Father, or however you want to refer to it, and so you can't stretch it legitimately to encompass them. But if you do want to do that, then you're maybe opening up another can of unfairness worms, because then all of a sudden, all of these people who died in utero and all of the 55 billion who lived before and the 30 billion who never heard, they automatically get saved, apparently. And then that's unfair to those of us who have to try to figure out what the correct requirements for salvation are, and then satisfy them, and so on and so forth. So it's like whack-a-mole. The unfairness would pop up in a different place.
So I think that's right. But I'm going to save my response to that objection to your third point, because I think that relates to, God doesn't exist because this world does. So I'll
Okay.
save my response to that there. But yeah, I would just say in terms of extending it to, and I got to keep an eye on the time. We'll go for another 6 minutes and then we can change topics
Sure.
if you want. But so I think I would argue you can't extend it to people that have never heard the gospel, because there is a category, and again, even the Catholic Church admits this category, that for people have to be willing and able. So people with cognitive disabilities, or people that are living over in Timbuktu and have never heard of the gospel, they're not able to respond or to meet those four conditions for salvation as you outlined. So therefore, God wouldn't judge them. They would be, as Paul puts it, excused on the day of judgment based on their own consciences and the knowledge that they were privy to. So yeah, I think you could extend it.
Well, I think we have a fundamental difference here, and unfortunately I was looking for my reference, but I have references that show that the Catholic Church explicitly denies that those people will be saved in the fullest sense of experiencing the beatific vision, the summum bonum, with that intimate relationship with God in heaven. They're going to not be damned, but they're going to be excluded from that. And as I
You're
said,
right. Yeah.
I wish I could find that, but
No,
anyway, yeah.
you are correct. I was wrong about that. Yeah, so you're right there. Again, I'm just a simple Baptist Protestant. I've got heaven and hell, salvation, damnation. So yeah, they've got different categories. So okay. So the last point. This is the toughest one, right? People perhaps like yourself that have heard the gospel. You are privy to that, but you quote unquote honestly reject the gospel message, or fail to fulfill the four conditions, at least one or of them, through no fault of your own. So that the first thing I would want to, oh, sorry, the first thing I would just want to come back and say, now remember, this is why I clarified your first premise about salvific opportunities. And so, for example, you can't point to yourself or any other atheist that you believe honestly doesn't believe or something like that until the point of no return, because God's obligation is to reveal the truth to you guys before the point of no return. So maybe tomorrow, God will reveal the truth. You'll come on my show and say, guess what? I'm a Christian. I realize the truth. So it's really only people that reach the point of no return and honestly fail to fulfill that matter. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Let's assume Christianity is true. At this moment, I'm still not damned. Uh, I won't be damned until I take my last breath, and I haven't satisfied the requirements. So yeah, right now, like you said, I could come on and see things differently and turn myself around. Mhm.
Gotcha. Okay. So then I guess the last question I'll leave to you, for we've got 3 minutes before we transition, but like, for your argument to work, then you would have to have evidence or knowledge that people up to the point of their death were honestly rejecting the gospel. How do you know that there are any such cases, or do you think you can prove such cases, or is it just kind of a statistical thing? Well, they were, to my mind, they were honest skeptics for most of their lives, so I'm going to just assume they were at the moment of their death or just before their deaths, or yeah.
Well, in order to not be saved, you don't have to reject. My understanding is you don't have to reject the gospel message. You just don't have to satisfy it. That's the requirement for missing out on salvation. Rejection is different than that. I suppose I could be said to have rejected the Christian salvific message. If I had died in utero, I would not have accepted it, just like I don't accept it now, but I wouldn't have rejected it. So that I think we have to make that clear distinction there. And I don't know if that sheds any more light on the situation or not.
Fair enough. Okay, cool. Well, that's it that I had written down in my notes in terms of assessing your argument. Just before I move on, let me turn it to you, since this is your argument. Is there anything I missed about this that you think is important to mention?
No, I think you did a good job, and as I said, I wish I had kept those references in front of me that I could actually show you, but I don't have them right now. But no, you did a good job. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, with that said, I'm going to remove your share screen for now, and so just keep it on your end, but it's removed from the screen. So now we're going to transition. Now it's my turn. Now I've got the burden of proof, and I wish I had prepared slides. I didn't. I might share my screen with previous slides I've made for other shows, just so Richard has something to see. But I want to cover the first positive reason I think Christianity is true, and that is from the evidence for the Shroud of Turin. As people know, I am rather famous for arguing for the Shroud. So this is kind of an argument for miracles. Okay, so there's nothing to show, so I'll just go. Now, essentially, how do I identify miracles? That I do have certain criteria, and this is going to be relevant for all 2 or 3 of the arguments I present and how I assess the evidence. So the first is you have to prove an event took place or something like that. In the case of the Shroud, there are images, and those images were formed. Those images have certain properties that have been proven scientifically, and the event in question is that those images were formed. That's what we need to explain, and I say a miracle explains them. The second aspect is we have to prove that the event is extraordinary to a reasonable person, and reasonable person I define as the legal definition, the average person with average intelligence, average wisdom, average discernment, because that's who I think God is targeting his salvific message to. So how would it be extraordinary? There are 3 ways that I look at. So the first is that you make a mechanistic argument. You look at the possible mechanisms that can explain it naturally versus miraculous or extraordinary mechanisms, and you show that it actually, none of the natural mechanisms can explain it, and it is indeed an extraordinary mechanism. The second way is through the uniqueness of the event. So we can show that the event is totally unique to extraordinary contexts. And I'll explain more about what that means in a bit. Despite a sufficient opportunity for being duplicated in an ordinary natural context. So that's the second way. The third way is through circumstantial evidence. So the event itself isn't extraordinary, but the attached circumstances are extraordinary in some way. Now, the third aspect, I mentioned the extraordinary context. And in this case, sorry, I'm just going to mute you just because you're making background noise. Sorry, Richard. All right. So religious authenticating context. So it's a religious context, but of a specific sort, whereby it serves to authenticate the religious message in question. So applying these criteria to the Shroud of Turin, I think it fulfills all of these criteria because we have an event. There are images on the Shroud. Everyone agrees with that. So somehow images were formed. They need an explanation. Now, how do we prove that the Shroud's images are extraordinary in terms of their formation? And on this front, I think we can construct a mechanistic argument. So we can argue that we've evaluated all of the available artistic mechanisms, right? So there are, in terms of painting hypothesis, the powder rubbing, scorch hypotheses, and the protophoto hypotheses, and all of the variations therein. And these options are exhaustive. You can tweak or modify something, but knowing the medieval history, there isn't some mysterious unknown option out there that we can appeal to that's plausible, historically plausible to appeal to. And we can falsify all those theories. Secondly, we can also evaluate the ordinary naturalistic theories. So pretend it's not an artistic image. It was a body covered in the shroud and somehow naturally sweat or direct contact or gases came out of the body and formed the images. And we've evaluated all of these various things, and we've scientifically falsified all of these, again, exhaustive type mechanisms. Therefore, the only thing left is a miraculous image. And by miraculous, I'm arguing for intelligent design. So if I can, let me just see if I can bring up where that slide is, because it'll help. I do have it in premise format somewhere, if I can find it. Okay, so maybe not, but okay, so just kind of remembering. So I have it's like the teleological argument. So with William Lane Craig, either the shroud images are due to random chance, natural laws, and or intelligent design. It's not due to random chance or natural regularities and that sort of thing. Therefore, it is due to intelligent design. Then I have a further argument going on. Okay, if the shroud images are due to intelligent design, it's either due to human artistic design or divine design. It's not due to human artistic design, therefore it's due to divine design. And what's the purpose? Well, it's to authenticate the Christian religion, because the images attest to Jesus's death as described in the Gospels, but also implies his resurrection. Somehow that body was removed from the shroud within days, because there's no decomposition liquids built up on the shroud, and the body is provably still in rigor mortis at the time. The body images were formed in an extraordinary way. So I think that implies resurrection, given the full religious context there. So that, in a nutshell, is my argument on the Shroud of Turin, if I were to put it into premise format to help Richard out and stuff. Yeah, sorry, I thought I had a slide ready to go with the premises for you, but I guess not. So that's my argument there, Richard. Yeah, I think that the Shroud of Turin, we have good reason, scientific evidence showing that there's something, that these images are extraordinary and take place within a religion authenticating context, and therefore a reasonable person would be justified in inferring these images are miraculous authentication of the Christian worldview. So yeah, over to you for your rebuttal. Oh, I'll unmute you. Oh, there you go.
Okay. Plugged in my headphones. Maybe that'll stop the feedback.
It might. Yeah, some people.
Okay. Now, is that any better?
That is perfect. So that is exactly what it was. Yeah.
Okay, that was the reason then. All right. Let me go back to my presentation here, and I'll make my comments. All right. I want to go.
We're still looking at your first argument.
Yeah. Okay. Is there any way we can get it larger so I can work on it?
Get it larger?
I mean, hold on. Okay, there we go. Now,
because we're seeing is like your first argument, and it's like total unsaved equals 301 billion plus 55 billion. So I'm
trying to get it so that I can move the scroll up and scroll down and do things to the screen itself. Let me do stop screen, and then start from scratch again. Okay, now I want to present. Okay. Share screen. Share screen.
And then it pops up a little box.
Yeah, hit window. And there. And then share. Oh, okay, that should do it. Let me all right.
Yep, there you go.
Okay. Now,
let's see. I'm going to respond here. Hold on a second. Okay, I want to go to page 13. Let's see, 11, 12. Okay, authenticity of the shroud. All right, my response has two parts. I should say this. I knew about the shroud, and I hadn't done a whole lot of in-depth examination and so on. And when you said that that was going to be one of your topics, I, of course, then started looking around, and I'm amazed at just how much material there is.
Yep.
All kinds of articles and podcasts and books and whatnot. It's an enormous area of interest, and I was trying to educate myself, and it made my head explode. But anyway, my response has two parts to your excellent summary, by the way, and argument for your point. In the first part of my parts, part one, I'll comment on technical matters concerning the shroud's authenticity, and in the second part, I'll comment on two non-technical questions concerning the shroud's authenticity. So, part one, my comments on technical matters concerning the shroud's authenticity. As I told you, it made my head spin, and there are so many disputed technical matters, and some of which you touched on. And of course, your view is that beyond a reasonable doubt, the evidence lies with not a natural explanation and therefore miraculous explanation. But there are just so many issues that have been dealt with. The pollen issue on the shroud, the radiation issue, the blood issues, the sudarium of Oviedo issues, the dating of the shroud, the anatomy of the man image there, even the grooming image. Some were saying, for example, that Jews at the time that Jesus lived kept their hair short because they thought long hair was something that God didn't approve of. And I think even St. Paul said something about it, whatever. The point is, a lot of technical matters there. And to master all of those is quite a feat. And if you've done that, good for you. But it was tough. All right. So my comment is this: test the shroud. All right, please. Now I realize it was tested in '88 or thereabouts, and that testing was flawed in a number of ways and so on. But it wasn't totally flawed. But and that's another one of the issues we could. Well, I have it up there. Dating. There it is. Dating issue. But I say test the shroud. Now, what do I mean by that? All right. What I mean is perform a strictly controlled, transparent, meaning that you'd have representatives of those who think the shroud is authentic, those who think it's not authentic, involved in the protocol. State-of-the-art testing. I mean, we are now 36 years more advanced than we were back in 1988. Presumably radiocarbon dating testing on the shroud. We know how to do it, and importantly, we know how not to do it. How last time maybe it was imperfect. In short, we have the means, method, and one hopes the motivation to do it. I'm looking at you, Pope Francis. And the reason I'm looking at the Pope, of course, is because essentially the Catholic Church controls it, and he controls the Catholic Church. So if he said to test it, it would get tested. Now, if such testing, and I'm sure you can agree with this too, Dale, if such testing gives a date definitively later than the 1st century, and definitively there, that's the key word, and done fairly and all so on. If it's a date later than the 1st century, then clearly the article is not Jesus's burial shroud. And we can all stop wasting a lot of time, energy, and resources arguing about it. So in effect, this would be cutting the Gordian knot. On the other hand, if the dating puts it into the 1st century or in the 1st century, then Well, game on. All right, skeptics, tell us what you're going to do now, what your view is, and we can proceed from there. And if we are going to be arguing, we're at least arguing from a point of information. And a lot of the things up here that I mentioned before would be looked at in a different light. All right. So as Larry the Cable Guy, I don't know if you remember Larry the Cable Guy, Dale, but his
Jim
famous
Carrey.
saying, "Get her done." All right, it's as simple as that. So in a sense, I've kind of punted on this. Your good presentation, I didn't really stop and deconstruct anything you said, but I've basically given my tested doggone thing. Okay, now my part two are my comments on two non-technical questions concerning the Shroud's authenticity. You actually touched on, I think, one of these in your talk there. Okay, what I asked myself is, okay, if as Dale says, and not just Dale, but others as well, Shroudies, I think sometimes they're called, that this is an authentic item, divine, miraculous item, why would God have created the Shroud of Turin? And the most plausible answer I could think of is that the shroud could be seen to serve apologetic purposes. And I think you mentioned that. You said it, confirms the truth of the resurrection, which in turn confirms the truth of Christianity, something along that line.
Yep.
Okay. So my response is, look, if God created the shroud for this purpose, for apologetic purposes, then I've got 5 comments. First, God would have ensured, if he's going to go to all the trouble to make this relic or to make this item, miraculous item, would he not have ensured that the shroud would have been discovered very early in its history? It apparently wasn't. It only comes into our knowledge in the middle of the 14th century. Second, God would have ensured that the shroud would have had a clear and secure chain of custody, which it doesn't. Third, God would have ensured that the shroud would have had better and less ambiguous forensic evidence supporting its authenticity than it has today. Now here, Dale, I can see you're going to take issue with that and say it has plenty of unambiguous forensic evidence and so on. But I would add, without proof, just saying the obvious, there are lots of people who would have a different take than yours. And some of them are even Christians themselves. And so I do think that this is basically the case, that there could be better and less ambiguous forensic evidence supporting its authenticity. Fourth, God would have ensured that the shroud would have had a positive dating test. He would want everybody to know that this is first century, and people like Schoenig would shut their mouth and get on board. And certainly if the shroud tested to the first century, that would at least give me a ticket. Whether I get on board or not, that's another thing. And then finally, God could have some clear and well-attested miracles associated with it. I mean, by clear and well-attested, I don't mean the kind of things that you sometimes see in let's say, Lourdes or something like that, but something undeniable. Of course, what atheists always refer to here as a typical example of what we're getting at is a restored leg or arm or something like that, where it's not a matter of psychosomatics or anything else. So I think those are some of the things that I think, if it were to serve apologetic purposes, we should see, and we don't see. And so I think that it casts doubt on that this is being done for apologetic purposes. And if it's not apologetic purposes, then what could be the purpose? I don't know. Of course, one could just simply say, God can do what he wants. He doesn't have to make it known to you why he does anything, which is, of course, true, but nevertheless, that's my 2 cents on that. Okay, question 2. Why does the Catholic Church refuse to let the shroud be tested? And my response there is, I don't know. It is interesting that the church refuses to authenticate the shroud. And if indeed, as Shroud advocates say, if the evidence is clear and compelling, one wonders why such a powerful and strong organization containing most Christians in the world, namely the Catholic Church, why it doesn't see that evidence is as clear as Shroud advocates say, and simply authenticate it. And so I think that's basically what I had to say on that, Dale. I'm done.
Awesome. Yeah, it's once again, I'm impressed, and I'm angry at myself. I wish I had actually prepared slides so it would have been even, and you would have something visual to look at. So I promise, if you are inclined to ever come back, I will do my due diligence as you've done here. So, okay, so I've heard I heard a number of objections, both technical and non-technical. So let me start with one that covers two things here. So the very first objection I heard is test the shroud, right? For the love of goodness sakes, and I fully agree with you, test the shroud. I mean, you have no idea. We've actually submitted proper scientific proposals. I'm friends with nuclear engineer Bob Rucker, and he's, I've been privy to the official proposals we've sent, all rejected by the Pope. So, why do Catholics, or specifically, it's not Catholics, because I can tell you the church in Turin, I have firsthand eyewitness testimony of this, are desperate to test the Shroud of Turin. But who stops it? The Pope. It's the Pope, not the Catholic Church,
right,
that is the current owner of that thing. And
right,
he, unfortunately, it'll never happen during this Pope's lifetime. That's just from insider knowledge. It's never going to happen, and that outrages us. But why are they not wanting to do it? I just need to be honest. It's because the 1988 carbon-14 dating rattled them. They make a lot of money from pilgrims coming in to see the shroud, and they don't want to upset the apple cart. That if they do further testing, they may get a result they don't like they did in 1988. And again, I'm not a psychic, but based on people who are actually primary witnesses, like Barry Schwartz, who taught at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences on the shroud, and was a member of the Stirp team in 1978. This is what he says: it doesn't, they're making money. Why risk losing that stream of pilgrims coming in? So I think atheists and skeptics should be correct, and I join with them in saying, shame on the Pope. Do better. Let's test it. If it is a fake, then let's get it out of the way. We want to know. But if it's true, my gosh, the implications of bringing skeptics like Richard to the fold. I'm sure if we tested it and it is provably a miracle of God, Richard would be converting to the faith. So it is a shame that they won't do further testing. I fully agree with your point on that.
One thing. Can I just add one thing at this point, Ned? Gail?
Yeah.
Dale, if there's another reason why I think the church should be motivated to do it, because if it does turn out to be authentic, the church, whether it's justified or not, the church could pat itself on the back and say, see, since we have been the guardians of this since the very beginning and so forth, it does seem to indicate that Roman Catholicism is the appropriate way for Christians to worship, etc., and so on. In other words, they could try to take credit that this vindicates not only Christianity, but Roman Catholic Christianity, which in their minds, I suppose, would be considered a very positive thing.
Absolutely. I would disagree with them, but I see your point. They could make that argument. So they would potentially have a motivation, and even extra motivation to. Okay. So the next thing that I want to bring up, and you said I would agree with you. Now, believe it or not, you've unfortunately met the one pro-shroud expert in the world who doesn't agree with this point. And I can actually, so it comes about the relevance of the dating. Let me just share my screen because I do have a slide I can show you. Are you seeing that on your screen?
No, but let me go back to. Okay, now, yeah.
Okay, so here's the Shroud skeptic's argument that you made here, right? So if the Shroud is provably medieval, then that's I think you referred to it as cutting the Gordian knot, right? Just
Yeah.
like Alexander. So then the Shroud images are probably not miraculous signs from God. Premise two: the Shroud is provably or probably medieval, therefore the Shroud images are probably not miraculous signs. Now, all of the debate is on this premise, right? And I would disagree that the Shroud is provably medieval, but I rather uniquely also challenge your warrant for premise one. I don't think it's warranted to say, well, even if the Shroud is medieval, I argue I don't care. All of the scientific evidence that I base my opinion that these images were formed as miracles of God to authenticate Christianity are still true. It doesn't matter whether the cloth covered the historical Jesus, it still has images that attest to the historical event of his death as described in the Gospels and that resurrection, and therefore still authenticates Christianity. So I don't think it's rational to go, well, if it's medieval, therefore the images are not miraculous. That doesn't.
In other words, what you're saying is maybe God just waited 15 or 1400 years and then did the miracle, and so therefore it's still a miracle. It's just that it wasn't a miracle from the start. It began sometime considerably later. Is that the point? It's still the fact that it's still miraculous, but who cares whether the miracle was done in the year 30 or in the year 1430 or 1530, or what if 1430?
Precisely. That's my argument. And again, I am unique. I will admit, I've had debates with Gary Habermas about this and stuff like that. So I recognize when people first hear this, they mock it. But I've done a lot of work considering this, and I would suggest. Look, nobody bats an eye when somebody's, if we're going with Roman Catholics for this thing, Marian apparitions happen throughout the centuries, right? To affirm the Roman Catholic faith. Miracle healings continue to happen today. If we could prove those are miracles, I would, no. Those can only happen in 30 AD when Jesus heals people. So I don't see any reason why we would have to assume that God couldn't make a miracle shroud. Miraculous images on a shroud in the 1300s.
I think you've made the point. Yeah, I'm not on board with it, but I mean I can see the logic of it. He's God; he can do what he wants when he wants, and yeah.
Okay, awesome. Well, that's great. So, and I have it here. Richard is a professional PhD philosopher, so that means I made a smart argument if he's agreeing with me. So, but to premise two then, right? So, the factual question: is it in fact medieval? And on this front, I would say no. I do believe the shroud did in fact cover Jesus in the first century, and so you alluded to the carbon dating, but you said something before that about it would be great if we had dating evidence dating it to the first century. Guess what?
By that I meant the carbon dating, really.
Okay. So let me just ask: Are you aware that there have been a total of 5 scientific dating techniques used to date the shroud, all of which date it to the first century? Or again, I'm not going to press it because I know it's new.
No, I'm not aware of that.
Gotcha. So these are most of these are controversial, right? Because they are novel techniques that, unlike carbon dating, they haven't been tried and tested in other secular fields. They've been invented by pro-shroud scientists. But I will say this: they have, at least in 3 cases, they've been published in secular peer-reviewed science journals of the same level as the Nature paper with the carbon dating. So Thermochemica Acta, like famous chemist Dr. Ray Rogers, he conducted a microchemical test comparing the vanillin in the shroud linen to the Dead Sea Scrolls and said they're an exact match. It dates to the first century. Most recently, you'll be seeing in the UK, apparently it's going crazy. The newspapers are going nuts, even though it's a 2-year-old finding. All of a sudden, for some reason, just right now, they're going nuts, saying the shroud is authentic. It's the exact opposite of the carbon dating. And over in the UK, they're freaking out about an X-ray test, dating test that was done by my friend Giulio Fonte and published in the science journal Heritage, where they conduct this X-ray dating of the Shroud's linen fibers and find out that from the depolymerization, they can date the Shroud accurately to the 1st century. So there have been multiple scientific dating techniques that have been used, and the only place they overlap is the 1st century. So there is some evidence, regardless of what you make of it, that does date the Shroud to the 1st century, and it has been published in secular science peer-reviewed journals. I'll let you respond to that, or do you want me to go to the carbon dating?
No, I will respond. I am admittedly not on top of all this, but I did listen to, and I know you're familiar with them, Reason to Doubt.
Yeah.
And they did a whole series of episodes talking about the Shroud and talking about what you were just saying. And if viewers, I'm not in a position to assess your claims here. I don't deny the facts of what you're saying, but the explanations of them and whether there are some caveats and so on, I think that's the place to go. I would sort of pass the baton to the what's his name, Jordan
Kareem, yeah.
The other guy's name is Jared, yeah. And they would be good to have on your show, perhaps. I know you've probably already talked to them, but I can't really be a responsible opponent here, and I'm willing to admit my my ignorance on that. But I know they had addressed some of the points that you would raise, and so that's all I had to say here.
Okay. If you don't mind, just one last follow-up on this thing, and it'll be a general type question. Sure. Because it's methodological rather than knowing the technical details. But so their main objection, right, on Reason to Doubt, that the reason why Jordan doesn't accept it, and why all Shroud skeptics like Hugh Ferry will reject it, is they'll say their objection is it's a novel technique, and therefore, well, has it been vetted? Could there be some fraud type thing going on, or some kind of something going on that, it just so happens this pro-Shroud guy invents these methods and he gets the 1st century. But here's my argument that I'd like to get your take on. Like, so if these methods are flawed, right, because they haven't been properly vetted, and I know Giulio Fonte as much as I know Jordan, it's not purposeful fraud. He's not a liar or a forger. He's not someone that would just make this up or something like that. I can attest to that personally, for whatever that's worth. The fact that all of these dating techniques with their error bars, the only place they overlap is the 1st century, that seems a little bit too coincidental for me. What would you make of that? If these methods are in error, as Jordan claims and all the Shroud skeptics think, why is it they all erroneously coincide on that 1st century?
Well, with all due respect, again, Dale, you're asking the wrong person. I'm just not familiar with all of the details here, and I would pass it off to ask that question to J&J, Jordan and Jared, and let them have a go at it. I'm just not in any position to really be a helpful interlocutor on this.
No problem. Okay. So last thing, I do want to cover your other non-technical aspect about, you gave 5 objections to, let's assume what I'm saying about the Shroud is true and all this, the apologetic purposes. So I think you said, why wouldn't he have done this, provided this scientific evidence straight from the beginning? Like, even if we assume the Shroud is a medieval miracle, it still took until 1978 for everyone to discover the evidence I'm using to prove that it's a miraculous image. So I think that's your first objection. And again, on this front, I think I would just say, well, providentially, God knows what he has to do to accomplish his ultimate purposes, which I'll disclose a little bit more when we get to one of your other arguments and presentations. But if God knew in advance that in order to achieve his ultimate purpose, he had to create the shroud in the medieval era, and then we would discover the scientific evidence after the fact, wouldn't that provide a defeater to what you're saying there?
Yeah, I think again, God can do whatever He wants, and this is a kind of a skeptical theism light thing. Who are you, Schoenig, to say that God should have done this or that or whatever? And of course, if God exists, that would be true. I mean, he has his reasons. He works in mysterious ways, whatever. So he could do it that way. On the other hand, if you look at it in one sense, I'm just trying to, with my finite human eyes, say, if this is meant to serve apologetic purposes, then it seems like I can think of what looks like better ways to do it and get better results. And if I can do that, then certainly God can. Now, I realize the response is, but once again, you're not God. You don't know. You think it might be better if he did it differently, but and I have no defense against that. That's if God exists, then he knows more than Schoenig does, and that's true.
Fair enough. All right, cool. Well, I think with that said, we are at the hour and a half mark. So I will transit. Or before we transition, is there anything else about the shroud that you wanted to say, or that you want to get my take on? Or
no, I think you covered it well. We both covered it well, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, with that said, let's transition back to you to give your second argument against Christianity there, and I'll bring up your slides.
Yeah. Okay. Oops.
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing. Just reshare.
Share screen. Window. Boom. Share. Okay.
All right, and I've added it. There you go. Yep.
Yeah. Well, messianic prophecies. That'll probably come later. Let's see. I want Heaven World. So that's page 5. All right. That's original sin. All right. Okay. The Heaven World argument for the non-existence of God. This comes from chapter 18 of Where Christianity Errs. And again, it's of necessity an abridged version, but I think it's still worth looking at. I start off with 3 important Christian beliefs that I think are uncontroversial. Number 1, God is maximally morally good, including having maximal love for humans. 2, the eternal post-mortem experience of the beatific vision of God in heaven is the highest good that humans can experience. 3, God wants all to be saved. So in short, God is maximally loving of humans. He wants everyone to be saved, and being saved is the best post-mortem fate that humans can aspire to. All right. Now, I'm going to use TW in red, actually, to stand for this world we inhabit. Okay. And then HW in green is a possible world that I call Heaven World. Now, when I say it's called Heaven World, I want the viewer to understand, in this world, there is a heaven, according to Christians. It's a part of this world. That's not to be confused with when I'm talking about Heaven World here, although there's going to be a similarity. But this world includes the physical world and the universe, plus, let's say, the spiritual world, which includes heaven. That's all in this world. Heaven world, on the other hand, is a possible world in which God exists, and the following: He creates humans. He endows them with free will. He gives them the ability to reason well. He gives them appropriate knowledge about themselves, their creator, and the circumstances of their creation. And he then directly offers each human that he creates the free choice to either eternally experience the highest good of the beatific vision of God in heaven, or to reject that choice in favor of some other option. I don't know what other option it might be. Maybe they want to be annihilated. Maybe they want to go to hell. Maybe they want whatever. But God is open to listen to that, and if it's possible to grant it. Notice that it would be disingenuous of me to say anything other than who would turn down the beatific vision of God in heaven. It is, even by Christians' understanding, the highest good for humans. And if anybody were doubtful about the choice, God could, in fact, say, well, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll give you 5 minutes of the beatific vision of God in heaven, and then I'll give you 5 minutes of whatever choice you pick, and then you'll have an informed basis on which to make a judgment. And I can't imagine anybody turning down that, the beatific vision of God in heaven. All right, so that to be said. In short, existence in heaven world would be similar to what Christians believe that human existence is like in this world's heaven. In other words, when people go to heaven, it's going to be the experience for them in this world's heaven is like what everybody will experience in heaven world. It's the absolutely best environment for maximal human flourishing. If you had any doubt, let's compare them. All right, so we have in this column this world, in this column heaven world. So let's look at certain conditions. Unfair human experiences. We know that in this world, there are some innocent people who live charmed lives. Things go well for them. It's enriching, fulfilling. They end up being saved. Everything is great. On the other hand, there are other human beings, innocent human beings in a sense, who in fact lived uncharmed lives. Things don't go well. Their lives are poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Thank you, Thomas Hobbes. And so all of that exists in this world. What about in heaven world? There'll be no unfair human experiences. As I've described heaven world, there's no room for unfair human experiences. Certainly not in the initial stage where people are asked what they want to do with their eternal destiny. And certainly once they choose to go into heaven world, in heaven world, then there would be no unfair experiences there either. Okay, unfair salvific opportunities. Fortunately, we've already talked about that. I made the case that they exist in this world. They would not exist in heaven world. Everybody gets the same opportunity. God speaks to you, gives you the choice. You make the choice. Boom, it's done. Here's a third one. 300,000 years of God's absence from humans. Does this exist in this world? Yes. This human species is estimated to be about 300,000 years old now. And by any reckoning, God's interaction in this world begins at most about 4,000 years ago. And that means that 296, or let's round it off, 300,000 years, God was absent from humans. That would not happen in heaven world, of course. God would be there from the very first moment, offering us the choice. 4, an astronomical number of specific instances of horrendous pain, suffering, harm, and premature death afflicting humans and animals. Will it exist in this world? Well, we certainly know that it does. How about heaven world? Well, there'll be no suffering in heaven world. All right. By the way, somebody might wonder, what is that number? 6 quadrillion, 2 trillion. What are you saying there, Schoenig? Well, I'm saying that that is a back of the envelope estimate of how many specific instances of this sort of stuff exists in sentient animals and humans. Now, sentient animals have been around for 500 million years, humans only 300,000. But you can add up, I'm not going to do it, although if anyone wants to know, I do have a slide on it. I basically estimate how many humans there have been, 117 billion were born alive, how many animals there have been, what the average lifespan can be expected for animals and humans, how many of these instances on average per year, per person, and so on. So it's an estimate, a rough estimate, but I think it's ballpark, just for clearing that up. And then finally, the presence of maximal goodness for all humans, not just some. Well, in this world, there is some of that, because according to Christianity, some people in this world get to go to heaven. And so they do experience maximal goodness, but certainly not all humans. Christians have been very clear about that, unless you're a universalist, I guess. And that's a whole topic for another day. But in heaven world, everyone essentially gets to have maximal goodness. As I mentioned, they would choose to accept God's offer. All right, so let's put it together now. In conclusion, given the 3 foundational Christian beliefs that I cited above, that God is maximally loving of humans, that heaven is the highest good, the summum bonum that humans can ever experience, and that God wants everyone to experience that. Given that, together with the moral advantages, the flourishing advantages that heaven world has over this world, I conclude that God would not have created this world if he existed. He would have created heaven world. But since heaven world doesn't exist, it can be reasonably concluded that God doesn't either. So Dale would tell you there's a modus tollens for those of you who keep track of these sorts of things operating here. Okay, Dale, that's what I had to say there.
All right, awesome. So yeah, maybe just leave your okay. All right. So definitely. So in terms of the premises of your argument, I'll start there. So is God maximally good, including being maximally loving? Yes, I would agree with that premise. I might qualify and say God is a really maximally great being. So he has all of the great making properties, including being loving to the maximal possible degree. So maybe, yeah, let me start there. Like, would you see that there, it can only be maximally loving to the maximal possible degree, whereby it's also consistent with his other properties, such as being maximally just, for example, and stuff like that?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Premise 2. So I think I agree with that. Like, so I'll just interchange heaven and salvation as the same thing. Theologically, there is a difference, but your argument is assuming the final state of salvation and calling that heaven world. So great. I totally agree with that. I think that is the highest good that humans can experience. That's what we are designed for. So premise 2 looks good. And then 3, God wants all humans to be saved.
Now, by the way, I can imagine, pardon me for interrupting, but I can imagine a Calvinist, go, what? Hold on. But go ahead.
Yeah. And thank goodness. So I'm not a Calvinist. The only thing I would say here is that I think this aspect, God wants all humans to be saved. Yes, God desires all humans to be saved. The Bible's clear about that. But at the same time, there are things like first order and second order desires. Maybe God wants all humans to be saved, but he can't create a world where all human beings are saved. And that's what I'm going to be arguing in terms of your 5 aspects. I'm going to be kind of denying those. So I guess we can go over those. Humans, endows them with free will, agreed. Gives them the ability to reason well, agreed.
The ones on these here?
The 5 things, yeah, the difference. There we go. Yeah. So, okay, so we kind of, with your first argument, we kind of already debated part 2, right? That I argued no, there are no unfair salvific opportunities even in this world. So, in terms of that contrast, I think we can put that one to the side just because we already debated that. In terms of 300,000 years of God's absence from humans, okay, so this depends, right? So one could be a young Earth creationist and deny that, but even as an old Earth creationist, which is the perspective I take, I would still deny that this is true because I think Adam and Eve were the first humans, quote unquote, human beings. They had the soul, whereby they could relate to God and be in this state with God and that sort of thing. And the Bible's clear, God was there with Adam and Eve from the beginning. And that's, again, I don't take Genesis in a literal fashion. I think the first chapter, 11 chapters of Genesis, the early history, are mytho-history. So if that's true, that you are able to make that consistent with the scientific data and stuff like that, and still argue theologically that God was there from the first ensouled human beings, Adam and Eve.
Well, he's of course there. I mean, if you're operating, let's say, from the Christian perspective, and if one of God's characteristics is he's omnipresent, but he wasn't there in the sense that pick a human being in the year 200,000 BCE, would he know anything about God or God's qualities or what he needs to do to be saved or how he should behave morally, what we would call moral? I don't think that would be the case.
Well, that's what I'm kind of raising as an objection. I would say, yeah, we would, right? Whenever the first humans, Adam and Eve, came about, if that's 300,000 years ago, then God was relationally present with those people, and the fall happened and that sort of thing. And okay, whatever happened after that kind of thing due to the fall, the repercussions happened in that. But I would deny that God was relationally absent 300,000 for the first 300,000 years. I think,
in other words, if I understand you correctly, the fact that God was present in the primal pair, that presence sort of carries over to all of their descendants. Is that the idea?
So no, like because I am in this where I do believe that the early chapters of Genesis are mytho-history, not myth. So there's history part. Like God was relationally present with all humans, starting from the very beginning with Adam and Eve, and obviously his relationship differed after the fall, but he was still relating to Noah, to Abraham in the way, and all of those guys, the Tower of Babel and stuff like that. So,
well, that's only what 4,000 years ago. What about the other 296,000 years?
Oh, well, not if Genesis is mytho-history. We're not supposed to count up the genealogies as though they're literal history. That's the mistake young Earth creationists, I think, make. They take this as the genealogies as literal history, and they count it up and say, well, Adam and Eve only showed up 6,000 years ago. I'm saying no, that actually Adam and Eve showed up 300,000 years ago.
Okay, but then let's say 40 generations after Adam and Eve, if you picked if you could do a thought experiment and there's a Homo sapien there, and you start questioning him, do you know about God? Do you know that he made the world? Do you know that he's omnibenevolent, all good, all knowing? I mean, if you could translate it into any kind of language that person would know, would that person just say, I don't know? Wouldn't that person just say, I don't know what you're talking about, essentially? God is not present in that sense. Now, he's present in the sense that as omnipotent, he keeps everything in existence, including these people, even though they don't sort of know it. In that sense, I guess God is present because he exists and he's everywhere. But he's not present in the sense that he's worshipped, or that anybody knows anything about him or what he wants from us or anything like that. I think that's my point.
Okay, so again, this is your argument, so you have the burden of proof. I would want to say, because you know that the evidence from 100,000 years ago, or it's extremely fragmentary. So how are you saying that there were no humans who worshipped God that 100,000 years ago, or 75,000 years ago? Maybe we travel back in time, we ask them, they're like, oh yeah, I do know who you're talking about. We have some evidence of human beings that didn't know, right? I think the oldest cave art's like 26,000 years ago or something like that, right? And it's possible because of the fall that there were human beings that would respond in the way you did through their own fault, through sin. They forgot or lost the knowledge. Just as I would say there are people today that, despite God being relationally present, there are people today that have forgotten that he existed and stuff like that. So in order for your argument to work, you would have to say God was completely absent relationally with all humans for the first 300,000 years. But I don't think the evidence can come anywhere close to supporting that.
Well, yeah, you set out the scenario that does describe both of our positions. I think that it's pretty clear that, I don't know, a peasant in Lower Egypt in the year 3200 BCE isn't going to know anything about Yahweh or the Christian God or anything like that. And you're saying somehow or other he's relationally present. Well, that I guess I'll die on that hill, I suppose. I don't know. Seems to me evident, but
okay, yeah, fair enough. Like I said, yeah, where we do have evidence and stuff like that, it doesn't seem they're monotheistic. They've been corrupted and pagan, like, at 3200 BC or 3100 BC, we know the first Egyptian pharaoh and the religious beliefs were not biblical beliefs. So I do admit, to your point, I do believe we have evidence and proof of a corruption or a loss of, God's relational presence, that it does exist in the record. But it's just, we can't prove that that's a total loss or something like that. Okay. So my next, so an astronomical number. Okay. So yeah. So this is kind of pointing to empirical facts that there is suffering and premature death and all sorts of stuff, right? The problem of pain and suffering. No suffering at all in heaven world. So yeah, I would agree. Okay, so let me agree with this just on the face of it, that yes, in heaven there is no pain or suffering. This is a logically possible state of affairs, right? However, yeah, here's where I'd want to push back. I don't think it's metaphysically possible for God to just create heaven, what we're calling heaven world. And we have to go through the earlier phases in order to arrive at heaven world, because our free will choices play a role in developing our character. And at that moment, we transition at a certain point. So here's an example, right? Even the Bible describes Satan. He was literally in what you're calling heaven world, and he still sinned. He still rebelled and said no, kind of thing. So obviously what you said, it's not true that if we're in heaven world, no one would reject it. Well, Satan and a whole third of the angels did. So I guess, yeah, if I'm going to phrase this as a productive question, like, how would you establish that it is metaphysically possible? So not just logically possible, but it's feasible that God could create this heaven world totally divorced of the prior stages, kind of thing, and that no one would sin or cause suffering of any kind, because Satan sure caused suffering to God when he rejected him.
Well, I think I turn the argument on its head, Dale. I'd say that it's very close to self-evident that if one were given a choice between heaven world and something else that isn't heaven world, and if you knew what the two choices involved, and I remember I added that as a possibility, God could give you a taste of each one. that anyone would in fact ever choose the alternative. And I think that's pretty clear. So I would use that to say that the story about the fallen angels is therefore put into jeopardy. Why on earth would Satan rebel and end up ultimately not only being defeated but suffering and all the other bad things that come with it? It boggles the mind, and he'd have to be insane or something of that sort. I think that's what I would respond.
Okay, so that is a good response, and I've thought about this and stuff on my end, right? So I think so. The good thing is, with your argument, also agrees with me that we have free will, right? We have the ability to choose to do or not to do something, kind of thing. So I'm assuming you mean that in the libertarian sense of free will.
Yes.
Okay, great. So we agree on that. But there is this thing, and it's proven scientifically. It happens all the time where people are stupid. They make stupid choices that boggle the mind. I myself have made choices in my life that boggle my mind. They go against what I know to be good, what I want, right? So people, for example, choose to take drugs or something that first time, they, even though they know, oh, methane or cocaine is really bad, it messes people's lives up, people still make that choice to do it. And I think what I would point to is there is a plausible way this could happen, and it's through acrasia, a weakness of the will, where even though your main desires are focused on what's good, you kind of, as philosopher Tamar Shapiro writes in her thing on free will, that you let go of the burden of freedom during a weakness of the will, and you temporarily kind of orient your will towards the lesser of your two desires, and you do the wrong thing. And that's why people cave in and the doctor said not to eat that chocolate cake because it's dangerous for my health. I can't help, I'm going to eat it. I'm just going to eat this one or something. We always do this as human beings. So couldn't acrasia help solve this issue and explain why it would be metaphysically impossible for God to create a world that in a heaven world that's eternal? Free will creatures are at some point or another going to cave into that acrasia, that weakness of the will.
Well, how about this? If there is somebody, when God gives them the choice, says that they want alternative X, then God would give them alternative X, and that would still be in heaven world, and that person would be, I suppose, happy there, even though it could be a lesser kind of happiness than in heaven world. And if that person said, I actually want to suffer, well, then that could be granted too. And if the person wants to suffer, then that suffering isn't really the kind of suffering that counts against eudaimonism or well-being. That person, for some reason, wants to suffer. So there still wouldn't be any suffering per se. There might be people who are feeling pain because they want to, but so be it. The other thing I would add too, and your comment sort of pushes me to add this maybe as a caveat next time, that if somebody does choose an alternative and going into the beatific vision with God, that they get the opportunity, if they want, to change their mind and come back, so that the only people who are not in heaven world themselves are people who don't want to be there. And if they don't want to be there, then that's the best possible world for them. And so, again, heaven world comes out looking pretty good.
Okay, so I'll let you. I want to move on to the fifth point, but I'll just say, like, believe it or not, that is somewhat similar to what I believe hell itself is. Right? It is the world. People choose to go there, kind of like C.S. Lewis said. Right? It's not a thing where you're forced to go there, kind of thing. Like it. Sorry, the gates of hell are locked from the inside, I guess, so to speak. That's kind of similar to what you were saying, right? So some people just want to suffer. They just don't want to live in heaven world as defined up in God's presence and stuff like that. So I can to some degree get on board with what you're saying. I still have some issues, but I would say that you are in good agreement with my friend David Russell, who's writing his thesis arguing exactly what you said about some forms of suffering aren't sinful, like they can be considered quote unquote good, even if it's lesser so than not suffering. Okay, so
Yeah, just to finish up on this.
Yep.
I guess what I could say in general is God says, look, I love you. This is heaven world now. I love you and I want you to have the best. I think that this coming to be with me in this eternal beatific vision thing and so on is the best for you. But if you don't want to do it, that's your choice. And so you tell me what you want. And by the way, anytime you want to change your mind, I'm here. And maybe that is a way to get around objections on this point 4. I think maybe I'm just repeating what I said earlier, but
yeah, no, it's good. It's good to kind of re-clarify it in those terms. Okay, so the last point is number 5, right? Presence of maximal goodness for all humans. So this is kind of piggybacking on my example of Satan, right? So my counter defeater for this is that I don't think it's metaphysically possible. It's not feasible for all humans to exist in this state of maximal goodness. And in fact, I would even argue that it's impossible for any creature who doesn't have the divine nature to live in a state of maximal goodness. I think at one point, every human being will choose to do some kind of sin at some point, and then the fall's triggered. So I would just want to put that to you and say, like, barring that, if it isn't metaphysically feasible for the maximal goodness for all humans, wouldn't it make sense that God would allow this world to exist if that was the only way to arrive at the maximal possible or maximal feasible goodness? As many humans as possible, free-willed humans as possible, achieving the maximal amount of goodness that's feasible for them.
Okay, if I'm understanding you correctly, you seem to be posing the possibility that having a situation where some people can choose to do evil in heaven world makes it a less worthy place than this world, where virtually everybody, at least according to Christianity, everybody sins, and some of them sin a lot, and all of the pain and suffering and so forth, that somehow or other still this world could be a world that has the maximal goodness for humans compared to heaven world. That seems like you're saying that this world now, as we understand it, is a better place to be than heaven in this world. And I think that would be very unchristian, to be honest. I mean, if you're in communion, the most intimate communion of love and creatureship with the person who made you and loves you, how can you do better than that? That's got to be the primary world of maximal goodness. That would be my response.
Okay, so I think the last thing I'll say on this, just to clarify, so I agreed with you. I wasn't saying, I think that heaven world, if it were feasible, is a better world than this world. But I don't see any, because the burden of proof is on you for this argument, I would say I don't see any reason to think that heaven world is feasible. The way I see it, I'll get your take on this before we move on to the next section, but the way I see it, there is, because creation is a free will choice, I think that there is a heaven world that is feasible, but what that world is just God existing alone. That's heaven world. There's no suffering, no absence of God for human beings and stuff like that. And I would say that the reason God could create this world is because heaven world, where God exists alone, has an equal overall value, all things considered. By God choosing to create this world, he has an equal total level of utility, right? So he gains goods from having an eternal relationship of salvation with more people than he would if it's just him alone with, the three people of the Trinity. But in order to get those additional goods, there's also the amount of bads, the people, the unsaved and stuff like that, and the suffering and all that comes with it as a bundle. And all things considered, that equals out to have the same overall. I hate using the word utility because I'm not a utilitarian, but that's the best thing to convey what I'm saying. It has the equal value to the heaven world where God exists alone. But the third alternative of heaven world as you define it, that's just, I'm for all I know, that's infeasible. That God couldn't have created that thing because it's metaphysically impossible for that such a state to come to effect. So I hope that kind of illustrates my thinking, and I'll let you get the last word.
Well, again, I'm not sure. Perhaps I understand metaphysical feasibility. I just go to some more plain talk, and maybe sometimes plain talk is good, sometimes it's not. What could be better than to have human beings make the most important choice that they have to make, and that is whether they want to be with God forever in a loving relationship. I mean, we have that choice down here, but it is distorted by a lot of static due to many different kinds of things, lack of knowledge, upbringing, family influences, pain, suffering. And so in heaven world, it's very simple. There you are. You have free will. You have enough intelligence. You understand what the stakes are. You understand what's going on. God even gives you a sample of each one. What better and more perfect way to make an unbiased choice just on the facts itself, and not because you didn't get enough evidence or you didn't get enough sleep or whatever. And so I still, I guess I'm going to stick with my idea of heaven world as superior to this world.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yep. I agree. It's superior. It's just that question of whether it's feasible or not. But awesome. Let you have the last word, and let's transition to my second argument then, because we are at a little over 2 hours now. So, messianic prophecies. So let me just take down and on this front, I do have some slides that I created for another show to show you if it's up. Let me pop that on the screen. All right. So just in a nutshell, I'm not going to go over all of this, but it's important to note that my argument for messianic prophecies is more nuanced. It's not an argument for the direct fulfillment of prophecies. I don't think I could meet that burden of proof. How on God's green earth would I be able to prove that Jesus not just died, but died for our sins? I can't prove historically that theological claim, for example. So because of that, I provide a more nuanced argument based on extraordinary circumstances. So it's a circumstantial argument. And what I argue is that given the provable messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, as being the biblically reasonable, plausible, and unfalsified fulfillment claims of Jesus in the New Testament, we have this weird circumstance where it's either Jesus is the Jewish Messiah or it's a bust. No one can be the Jewish Messiah. It's either Jesus or nothing. It's not Jesus Bar Kokhba or bust, or Jesus Simon Cowell or bust, or something like that. It's only Jesus or bust. And I argue these are extraordinary circumstances because they're unique. I've never seen, other Jewish candidates for being the Jewish Messiah argue similarly in a convincing, with the same level of convincing prophecies. So the prophecies that you use have to be of a sufficiently remarkable or quote unquote extraordinary nature, right? So you can't just say, well, I prophesied Jim Bob, and I prophesied he's going to be a human. I prophesied he's going to have 2 eyes and 2 arms. And oh my gosh, look at that. Jim Bob, he does have that. No, that I'm talking about stuff that's a little bit more significant or extraordinary nature for the prophecies. But the key here is that I don't have a burden of proof to prove the fulfillment actually took place. I'm looking at just the unfalsified claims and the fact that those make Jesus unique compared to everyone else. You have this either Jesus or no one. That doesn't apply to any other Jewish candidate that I've seen. Beyond that, I think in order to prove the uniqueness, you have to say it's unique despite a sufficient opportunity for duplication in another context. So it's not enough to look at, biblical prophecies about the Jewish Messiah. Look at other religions. Is there the same unique, extraordinary circumstance of, Hare Krishna or bust? Are there prophecies about Hare Krishna or the Buddha or some other religion that's of the similar level of extraordinariness? And the unfalsified claims of the Buddha show that it's either Buddha or bust. And my answer is no. This circumstance is totally unique. And just to quickly go over, I'll just name 3. So we have Isaiah chapter 9 that predicts the virgin birth. Okay. I don't argue for the virgin birth. I just argue that, behold, there will be the Messiah will be born, and his birth will serve as a supernatural sign that Emmanuel, that God is with us. Okay, well, Jesus did claim that, right? He even claimed, even more remarkably, what was the nature of the supernatural sign? Well, he was born of a virgin. But the prophecy says he was born in a supernatural manner that served as a sign to Israel that God was with us. Jesus has unfalsified claims fulfilling that. Then we have, in terms of his ministry, Isaiah chapter 53, his death. And I would argue Isaiah 53 predicts his resurrection as well. Well, Jesus has unfalsified claims that he died and that he rose from the dead. So he fulfills this, and we can get into the details on that. And then finally, Daniel chapter 9 is the timing. When did this have to take place? And I think Daniel chapter 9 proves that the Messiah had to be killed and then rise from the dead before the second temple was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. So this puts a timestamp, right? You can't get out of it. You can't avoid this by doing what modern Jews do, right? Rabbinical or Orthodox Jews do, and say, well, there's always a third option. You could have Jesus, a future unknown Jewish Messiah, or bust. Well, no, because we know the Jewish Messiah had to come and die before 70 AD, you can't appeal to Bar Kokhba, who lived 70 years after the fact, or any unknown future Messiah. Those guys are ruled out. They've been falsified by Daniel 9. So that, in a nutshell, is my case. Again, depending on where Richard wants to go, we can get into details and stuff like that. But what's your take on my circumstantial messianic prophecies argument?
Okay, let me get back to, let's see if I can get back to my screen here.
Yep.
All right. By the way, if you see me chewing gum, I'm not trying to be.
I never consider. I was always the guy chewing gum in class. I never.
Yeah. Well, I'm doing it because on past occasions, when, especially speaking a long period of time, I would lose my voice. So I'm trying to avoid that here.
Okay.
All right.
I do as well. Yeah.
All right. So let me see. I want to move ahead quickly. All right.
Yep. There. You just passed it.
Yeah. Boy, you got good eyes to see that. Okay. I start out with some general challenges with assessing the veracity of messianic prophecies. And these are sort of boilerplate caveats, ambiguity and interpretation, prophecies, and not just in having to do with messianic prophecies, any kind of prophecies, whether it's Nostradamus or whatever. Prophecies are often vague and open to multiple interpretations, making it difficult to assess their fulfillment. Different readers may interpret the same prophecy in different ways. Historical context, the context in which a prophecy was made, can affect its interpretation. Understanding the historical and cultural background is crucial, but, and this is important, it can be complex and contested. Selective fulfillment, prophecies might seem as fulfilled only when specific events align with them. This selective process can lead to confirmation bias, where evidence is interpreted in a way that confirms a prophecy rather than objectively assessing its validity. Subjectivity, the assessment of prophecies, is often influenced by personal beliefs and religious perspectives, which can skew interpretations and evaluations of fulfillment. Lack of precise criteria, there's no universally agreed upon standard for what constitutes a fulfilled prophecy. Criteria for fulfillment can vary widely among different traditions and scholars. Evolving definitions, the understanding of what constitutes a Messiah or the nature of messianic expectations can evolve over time, complicating assessments of whether prophecies were fulfilled as originally intended. Now, I know you're familiar with all of these, and you would say that's all of that's right, but I don't violate any of them. And okay, that's fine. But let me go over some examples that I think could be considered flawed messianic prophecies, or messianic prophecies, I should say, that weren't fulfilled. Now, you mentioned this one here, Isaiah 7:14 in Matthew, where he maintains that Isaiah, the way he reads it, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Okay, well, the evaluation here, and this reflects some of the items I just mentioned. Matthew accepts the relatively gratuitous translation of the Hebrew word alma as virgin, when its more precise meaning is young woman of marriageable age. The precise Hebrew word for virgin is betula. And just another point, Jesus his name was never Emmanuel. So there are maybe ways around some of these things, but they still, I think, are important to raise. The Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. That's Micah 5:2. The evaluation, at least my evaluation, and many others too, it's unlikely that Jesus was in fact born in Bethlehem. We only have 2 nativity stories, and they are quite discrepant. And the idea that he was born in Bethlehem, I think, is quite contestable. We could do a whole program on that, but I'll throw that out there anyway. Messiah would be buried for 3 nights, for just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Matthew 12:40. Jesus was buried only 2 nights. That's not the end of the world. I mean, it's not the major problem, but it is a discrepancy. 4, the prophecy of the suffering servant that you mentioned in Isaiah 53 was fulfilled by Jesus' suffering. This was something that the Jews never thought, and it is their, initially, of course, their scripture. They never interpret the suffering servant in Isaiah as the Messiah. The suffering servant was, for them, Israel. I know there's a great deal of dispute on this, and lots of smart people have written things on both sides. And again, I'm just sort of skimming over the top to show how one could raise questions about messianic prophecies. 5, Old Testament prophecy said that Jesus would be called a Nazarene. Matthew 2:23, he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. So it was fulfilled what it was said to the prophets, that he would be called a Nazarene. There's no prophecy that we could find about that. So one wonders what Matthew had in mind there. 6, in order to satisfy the messianic prediction in Zechariah 9:9, Matthew constructs a risible, a kind of funny scene in which Jesus simultaneously rides triumphantly into Jerusalem on 2 donkeys. This is in Holy Week, when he comes to Jerusalem ultimately to be crucified and then resurrected and so on. But he makes this dramatic entrance into Jerusalem, and because Matthew read Zechariah 9:9, Matthew constructs a scene where the disciples get 2 donkeys, and somehow or other Jesus rides on them like some sort of circus thing or something. And the evaluation is that, look, Matthew didn't properly understand a relevant aspect of ancient Hebrew phrasing. As Reluctant Christian points out, in ancient poetry, especially Jewish poetry, you'd offer up one line of poetry and then follow the first line with a second line that reinforced the first line, further emphasizing it. You see this in the Psalms, for example. When Zechariah does this, he says, ride in on a donkey, and then the next line is on a colt, the foal of a donkey. That sounds like we've got like 2 different animals here. But Zechariah is really talking about one donkey here, with the second line repeating with emphasis the first line. But Matthew just doesn't get it. Let me try to do it in a more up-to-date example. What if you read the headlines in the newspaper, Dale, which said, the Yankees beat the Blue Jays 7-0. And then the next line was, New York beat Toronto big time last night. Someone might say, well, there were 2 games there with 4 different teams. The answer is no, that the second line was just a reinforcement and a clarification, possibly clarification of the first one. So anyway, let me just read this paragraph and then I'll be finished. In summary, this brief assessment of challenges to verifying the fulfillment of messianic prophecies shows that the gospel writers weren't primarily engaged in writing unbiased factual history about Jesus. Rather, they wrote to advance the faith, charismatic interests, and were clearly willing to do whatever is necessary in their writings, including fabricating events about Jesus in order to advance their faith advancing purposes. Okay, so I think that's what I wanted to respond.
All right, perfect. So let me remove that. So, okay, so you raise, okay, so the first thing in terms of your general critiques, I see the first 2 as kind of just being the same thing. Like you're saying that the prophecies appealed to are ambiguous and it's hard to interpret what are they actually saying, and that sort of thing. So on that front, I would agree with you that there are differing interpretations of some of the messianic prophecies and stuff like that. But the question has to be, who cares? There could be any number of reasons as to why there are different interpretations. We have to ask, what are we reasonable in believing is the correct interpretation and that sort of thing. And on that front, I think that we can make a case for the messianic prophecies as to what they're actually saying in terms of what I meant. And I'll get into a couple of those specific examples, because you raised Isaiah 53 and also the virgin birth prophecy as a couple of examples that demonstrate that, these things are just hopelessly ambiguous. We have no idea which interpretation is correct. Now, the third thing is selective fulfillment. And I agree with you that this is a critique. And I didn't mention in my opening case, because I forgot, part of my argument also includes that, hey, look, to avoid selection bias, it's not enough that I'm just selecting the, in this case, the 3 messianic prophecies I used to make my case. We also have to take into effect all of the messianic prophecy, provable messianic prophecies, and take that into account, because there may be messianic prophecies that Jesus didn't claim to fulfill, or claim to fulfill, but it's been falsified, as some of your examples try to say. And that would destroy my argument, because it would just be a bust. We wouldn't have Jesus as a viable candidate to say it's Jesus or bust. It would be a bust kind of thing for everything. The subjectiveness, I'm not sure. I don't. Sure, there's always an element of bias, but I mean, so long as we've got reasons and we're justified. I mean, I could dismiss all of science as it's just subjective, right? Scientists are giving no, they're presenting objective reasons for why they believe or something like that. So I think it's the same here with messianic prophecies. I agree with you about the lack of precise criteria. I do think that there are generally agreed upon criteria that people use when evaluating fulfilled prophecy, and some of those also apply even to my argument. So, for example, right, one of my criteria is that the claims can't be falsified. If somebody has a falsified claim, that's irrelevant for making my argument. So I think everyone would agree with that. Or the prophecy has to be written before the unfalsified claim comes about. Otherwise, it's not a prophecy. It could just be written after the fact. So, I think there are criteria that can be universally agreed upon and would be sufficient. Your sixth and last point was evolving definitions. I'm not sure. I forgot what that was about.
The definition of Messiah or the nature of messianic expectations can evolve over time.
Okay. Now, so long as this is true, and I do think that the messianic hope, and we see this in Isaiah 53, the Isaiah 53 prophecy, it does evolve. The understanding crystallizes and evolves over time. But for my argument to work, that's fine, so long as nothing that the understanding of the Messiah doesn't change in such a way as to contradict the previous understanding. So if God makes a prophecy, hey, the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem, and then 100 years later he says, and the Messiah will be a descendant of King David. Well, that's fine. Okay, my understanding's evolved, but it's not contradictory. Whereas would you agree with kind of my just general responses to your general points there?
Yeah, the only thing I would caution, I'm not sure, you used the phrase a couple of times in our discussion today, can't be falsified. You probably don't want to say that. I think what you want to say hasn't been falsified, because if it can't be falsified, then you're dealing with the retort that you have an unfalsifiable hypothesis and therefore it is vacant because there's nothing that could possibly prove it to be false. And I don't want to put words into your mouth. What I would want is a hypothesis that could be wrong, but isn't wrong, and in fact has undergone lots of good, strenuous testing showing it isn't wrong. That I don't know if that's helpful to you or not.
100%. So go ahead and put those words in my mouth, because if I've been saying can't, then that's totally wrong. Yeah, it's just saying, as a matter of fact, they haven't been falsified as of yet, kind of thing. Yeah, because like I said, there can be, you've presented reasons, and I'll get to your specific things in a moment. You've presented at least one or two things that you think do represent falsifications, right? They would falsify Jesus as the Messiah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it can be falsified. It's just, well, has he been or not? All right. So getting into your specific things. So in terms of Alma, so I'll just say that this is an unproven defeater, right? So it's not true that the Hebrew word for virgin is betula. No, I can prove to you that we use the word betula to mean young woman who's not a virgin all the time. By the way, we can also use Alma to mean virgin, as well as young woman. There is no one Hebrew word that unambiguously means virgin. So that's just not true as a skeptical line of attack. The truth is, in terms of 8th century BC Hebrew words, we don't know. Alma, maybe it does mean virgin, or maybe it doesn't. We can't prove what it meant at that time. We're just making kind of an inference. And I would agree with the skeptical inference that given what we know, I think the best interpretation of the word is as a young woman, not a virgin. So I would agree with that. Although the Septuagint does define this word as being a virgin, a Parthenos kind of thing. And that's where Matthew was getting his interpretation from and stuff like that. That said, here's my response to this claim. Let's pretend you're fully right. Isaiah was prophesying that a young woman would give birth as a supernatural sign to the house of David that God is with us. Okay, Jesus fulfilled that, right? If Matthew wants to give us extra details that don't contradict that, Mary was a young woman and a virgin, right? So the more the better, right? We're getting additional details that Isaiah doesn't prophesy, but all of the details Isaiah does prophesy also came true. Like Mary wasn't an old hag at the time she gave birth to Jesus, right? So that would be sort of my comeback. This kind of semantic debate, I don't see falsifies any of Jesus' claims, and at best, it helps provide additional details as to what Isaiah was maybe had in mind when he was prophesying a supernatural sign. Well, a virgin birth, if that happened, that would qualify. What would you make of that?
Well, I have to admit right off the bat that I'm not a biblical scholar by any means.
Me neither.
But I would add that getting back to the word betula, in other parts of the scriptures, the Old Testament, my understanding is when it was clear that the author meant virgin, the word betula would be the word that was used. That doesn't mean, and you're quite right, it doesn't mean that betula couldn't be someone who is just a young woman, but you don't know whether they're virgin or not. But that's one thing. And likewise with Alma, it is a young woman, and she could be a virgin. All right. But you would think that as important as for those who think that virginity is important in all of this, and apparently you're not one of them, then the word betula should have been the word that was used there. So that was the one thing I wanted to say. Let's see. The other thing is that, again, my understanding is that the Jews never saw this as a messianic thing. That in fact the situation is that Jerusalem is under siege by the nation of Israel to the north, and also Syria. And the king, whose name I can't remember, is freaking out. And so he brings in the court seer and says, what's going on here? And the religious seer says, don't fret. There is a woman. She is pregnant. And she's going to have a son. And by the time her kid gets old enough to know the difference between right and wrong, your enemies will disperse. And that's what it was understood by in Jewish history. Now, I think it's not beyond the realm of possibility that Christians scour the what we call the Old Testament, looking for some ways we can interpret something as a messianic prophecy. And obviously, Matthew thought this was something he could use, even though, by the way, in the Masoretic text, also it's gratuitous to interpret it as will conceive. That Hebrew doesn't have a future. And so it's essentially has conceived is what's going on. And that fits in with the perfectly historical event of the Syria and Israel ganging up on Judah. And so that would be my comment there, for what it's worth, again, from someone who's not a biblical scholar.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I'll full disclosure. I'm not a biblical scholar either. I've looked at what they have to say, but I'm not an expert any more than you. So, all right. So, yeah, I guess I'll let you have the okay. Let me just say that. Okay, let me say this because this is a new objection. You said there's no reason to take this as a messianic prophecy, right? And okay, that would kill. Maybe I shouldn't be using this as part of my case then because it's not a messianic prophecy. But I think a lot of biblical scholars say that it is, and here's why. Because you have to take it in full context, as you mentioned, right? In its historical context, Isaiah's chapter 9 is connected with chapter 10 and 11. And it's clear by the time we get to Isaiah 11, it's clear. This is where it's evident that the whole three of these chapters are connected and do have a future messianic outlook, including naming the child, the Prince of Peace, the Eternal Father, all of these names, which are symbolic, including Emmanuel, right? So it's not a prophecy that he's literally going to be called Emmanuel. He is Emmanuel. He's the embodiment of Emmanuel, just like he's going to be the embodiment of these other things mentioned in Isaiah chapter 11. So yeah, that was the only other thing that I think is worth kind of responding to is that if you look at what biblical scholarship says, Isaiah 9 is not just in isolation. It's a part of connected to Isaiah chapter 10 and 11. And it's in light of reading those two chapters in full that you realize this is, in fact, a messianic, future-looking prophecy. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
Okay.
All right, cool. Your next objection, the Messiah is not going to be born in Bethlehem or something. Now, you're going to like this, Richard, because there's a reason I didn't raise this. And I think it's because, I disagree with you. I do believe Jesus was born in Bethlehem. I believe the Gospels, that sort of thing. And I may even believe that Micah 5:2 is a messianic prophecy saying he would come from Bethlehem. But I can't prove that because you are right as a skeptic, and even pro-Christian biblical scholars will admit that this prophecy is ambiguous. Is it saying that the Messiah will be born in the location of Bethlehem? Or is it saying that his ancestry will be rooted in Bethlehem because he will be a descendant of King David? King David was from Bethlehem. And I from what I know of the biblical scholarship, we can't really prove either way. And that's why with Micah 5:2, the only thing I find significant is that it predicts the divinity of the Messiah, that this ruler will be divine. He will have his origins from ancient times, which is another way of saying eternality in the Hebrew there. He'll be eternal, which implies a divine nature. So if I were to use Micah 5:2, which I didn't in my case here, that's where I would use, because I don't think we can prove the location of the Messiah's birth. So yeah.
Okay.
All right. The 3 nights. Okay, so 3 nights versus 2 nights. So I have a fan in the audience here, Chris Lucas. Give me the pro. Where does he say this? Okay, so he says he watches so-called Christian apologists get killed by Muslims on this whole 3 days and 3 nights thing because they keep trying to use the Catholic Friday crucifixion. So he takes the view that Jesus was crucified on Wednesday, and therefore there's no problem with 3 days or 3 nights. Now, to present another view, I am one of the Christians. I disagree with Chris on this. I do think Jesus was crucified on the Friday, but it's still not a problem because we know historically that for ancient Jews, it was an inclusive day, right? So Jesus was crucified on the Friday, and he all day on Saturday, and then part of the day on Sunday, kind of thing, right? The morning time. And part of a day, from my understanding, represents a full day for the ancient Jewish mindset. So he was literally there for 3 days under the Jewish understanding of the term, right? So long as he's there before sunset or whatever, whenever the day started. It's not like our day where it's 12 to 12. I think it's 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. or something like that. They have a different start date. And as long as you're there for part of a day, you can count that as a full day. And that's how I would solve it. Or you have Chris's solution, where he says Jesus was buried on Wednesday, and therefore there's no issue with the literal 24-hour interpretation.
I follow that, and I wasn't taking issue with the fact that he would be 3 days in the heart of the earth. I think that's true. He was probably buried on Friday before sunset, so that's one day. He's there Saturday. That's a second day, and then Sunday is a third day. Fine, but still only 2 nights, not 3 nights. That seems to be the problem.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. Yeah, I don't know offhand the answer. I know my friend Teddy Pappas has done actual research into this based on the ancient mindset and stuff, and she's provided an answer to that. I just don't remember what it is. So
okay.
But that, yeah, fair enough. All right. Isaiah 53. Okay, so now you mentioned, so here's the thing where your first point comes in, right? So you might say, well, it's ambiguous. I hear Rabbi Tovia Singer over here saying it's about Israel, right? Yeah. Versus Michael Brown saying, no, this is clearly about the Messiah. So here's where I would say, like, this proves my point that I can prove objectively with reasons. Here, I'll just remove your thing and bring up my slides for a second, if you don't mind.
Okay.
We have reasons that we can falsify the nation of Israel interpretation, and I present 5 of them right here, right? So in the first place, the servant, for Isaiah 53, there are a total of 4 servant songs. The full context here is Isaiah 40 to Isaiah 53 as the 4th and final servant song. So these represent the servant songs. And in the beginning, the suffering servant is the nation of Israel. It's clearly so, up until about chapter 48 or 49. Then it's clear that it's not Israel. And the text itself actually refers to the nation of Israel and the suffering servant doing things for or against the nation of Israel. So it's clear if you actually just read the text, it's impossible textually for the nation of Israel interpretation to be correct. So, and historically, no Jew for the first 1,000 years interpreted it this way. No authoritative source, Jewish source, interpreted this text as referring to the nation of Israel until Rashi in the 11th century. The servant is depicted as righteous, yet lowly and afflicted, despised and rejected. Israel has never been totally righteous, with no deceit in its mouth in history. And so this violates God's covenant with Israel. The suffering servant in this Isaiah 53 prophecy is depicted after his suffering. He is said to be highly exalted so that kings and leaders around the world would stand in awe of him and bow down to him. Israel has never been highly exalted to the point that Gentile kings and leaders have bowed down to him. Israel's suffering at the hands of Gentiles through nations like Assyria, Babylon, the Greeks, Romans, Nazis, etc., they've only ever been brought further condemnation on the Jewish people and the nation as a whole. That is Jesus. That's the covenant I was referring to, right? The nation of Israel behaves sinfully, not like the Isaiah 53 servant, not perfect and like a lamb to the slaughter, but when they behave sinfully, that's when God brings Gentile nations to punish Israel. So it's the exact opposite. It's I would say textually impossible for the nation of Israel to be the suffering servant in Isaiah the 53 prophecy.
Well, I appreciate everything you're saying, Dale, and I'm not going to dispute it because I'm way out of my area of expertise, but sounds like you should contact Rabbi Tovia and see if you can get him on, and the two of you can get into it in greater detail.
I would love that. Yeah. He was helpful when I was before I was a Christian. He was very helpful to me when I was doing my research there. So yeah, I've never had him on the show. I would love to have him on. So yeah. All right, cool. So yeah, I think is there anything else that you on the messianic prophecy thing, or should we move on?
Yeah, I think we should just probably move on. It's
Getting late.
we're putting in some minutes here.
Absolutely. I'll let this be the last one. So I'll give you the last argument that you want to present.
All right, let's see here.
Thank you for your patience, by the way.
Oh,
sorry, we're going
thank you
over
for
time.
being such a generous host here.
No worries.
Okay, so I want to go back to the original sin. That's on page 8. All right. Okay. By the way, this shows one thing about me. I may not necessarily be a genius, but I am pretty doggone well organized. I'll give myself that credit. All right. Okay, so Critique of the Doctrine of Original Sin, DOS. And this is from chapter 1 of my book, Where Christianity Errs. And I think it's appropriate, perhaps, that it is chapter 1, because part of the point that I try to make here, especially in the second part when I talk about the problems, is that original sin is something that at least many Christians, if certainly not all, would say is crucial to the understanding of the integrity of the case for Christianity. All right, so I'll start with something that I know, Dale, you're familiar with, and maybe some of your readers are, or many of you anyway. But let's just go over and make sure we've got, we're reading from the same page here. The doctrine of original sin is, for those who believe it exists, is extracted from the Garden of Eden story, found in Genesis chapters 1 through 3, which describes how God created the world and the primal human pair, Adam and Eve, placed them in a garden of delights, Eden, filled with pleasing plant life and animals. At this point, Adam and Eve were immortal and immune to pain and suffering, as presumably were the animals in the garden. Though Adam and Eve were invited to enjoy the garden, God commanded them not to eat the fruit of one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, lest they die that very day. Nevertheless, they succumbed to the wiles of a talking snake and ate from the tree. Most Christians refer to this first moral transgression, an act of disobedience, as the original sin, or sometimes it's called the ancestral sin, I think, in the Eastern Orthodox, which broke the perfect world God had created. As punishment for original sin, God exiled Adam and Eve from the garden and sentenced them to suffer and eventually die. Their punishment also included God's altering their originally created, perfected natures into natures that were now corrupted. This rendered Adam and Eve inclined to sin and to be unable to rehabilitate themselves from their fallen state. In addition, God decreed that Adam and Eve's fallen state be passed on to all of their descendants and shared as well, where applicable, by animals. All right, so I think that's, in a nutshell, the basic Garden of Eden story, that from which the original sin is extracted. What I'm going to argue in the remainder of my presentation here, which is going to be less than 10 minutes, is that there's a good case to be made that Christianity can't live with a doctrine of original sin, but also good evidence to show that it can't live without it either. So there's a real problem if I'm right. So let's look first at why I think Christianity can't live with the doctrine of original sin. I start out with looking at the Garden of Eden story, and it has a number of problems: factual problems, problems having to do with morality, problems having to do with history and science, and problems having to do with epistemology, or, as we say, knowledge claims. So let's look at those more closely. The Garden of Eden story, in which the doctrine of original sin is embedded, has factual problems. Namely, it is disconfirmed by reams of well-attested historical and scientific data. In other words, I don't think this needs to be, unless we're going to debate young Earth and old Earth creationism. I think the Garden of Eden story has problems for old earth creationists in the sense that it seems to fly in the face of, as I put it, reams of well-attested history and scientific data. Too obvious for me to have to even point out, but if Dale, if you want me to, we can talk about it more. Second, doctrine of original sin has, I think, serious moral problems. I think there are 4 of them. First, it's not clear that immorality can be justly imputed to Adam and Eve's actions, since the pair apparently lacked the full basic knowledge of morality before they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so in that sense, they are more like young children. They are not morally accountable because they didn't quite get the notion of moral and immoral. Second moral problem, a just punishment should have taken as a legitimate mitigating circumstance the fact that recently created, perhaps childishly innocent primal pair was no match for the wiles of the talking serpent, who, according to Christian tradition, I don't know if it's biblical tradition, but Christian tradition, maybe it's in Revelation, I don't know, tradition is usually identified with the devil, that is Lucifer. According to that tradition, Lucifer, the shining one, is the most powerful and brilliant creation of God. And so we shouldn't be surprised that such a being was able to bewitch these newly minted, very innocent human beings. In fact, it brings to mind the fact that maybe God could be charged with bad parenting here, to let his children play in a garden where he knows there's danger awaiting them in terms of this serpent and so on. I mean, would you let your child play in a, let's say, a public park if you knew that there was a lion that was escaped from the circus and it's roaming that park now? The answer would be, of course, no. And if you did allow it, you'd be considered an unfit parent. Third, God's punishing Adam and Eve with a period of lengthy suffering followed by death. And if the Bible is to be believed, it is lengthy. I think they died at age 930 or something, followed by death. That punishment seems to be disproportionate to their rather harmless infraction. They ate a piece of fruit when God told them not to. All right. Is that merit lengthy punishment and lengthy pain and death? I mean, would a human parent who told their child don't eat any chocolate chip cookies and the child sneaks in and eats a chocolate chip cookie, would that child then be subject to corporal punishment and then finally killed? No, of course not. All right. Fourth, God's collective punishment of death and suffering for all of Adam and Eve's descendants and all the animals as well, none of whom had anything to do with original sin, was patently unjustified. Collective punishment is morally problematic, to say the least. All right. Denis Diderot, a French thinker and critic of religion, wrote tartly in 1762, quote, "The God of the Christians is a father who is a great deal more concerned about his apples than he is about his children." All right, well, I had to let Dennis get his shot in there. Okay, now, so we've got so far factual problems, scientific and historical, then moral problems. Now there's a problem with divine knowledge. And the problem gets spelled out like this. Either there was a primal human pair whom God could have known would pass the test, or there wasn't. If there was a human pair that God could have known would pass the test, then he should have created that pair instead of creating Adam and Eve. Because if in doing so, he would thereby avoid, presumably, all the pain and suffering and anguish and harm and premature death and so on that has bedeviled, no pun intended, the world for the last X million years or thousands of years and so on. On the other hand, if there wasn't any pair that God could have known would pass the test, then clearly the test would have been unfair, and God should have dispensed with it altogether. All right, and I made a reference to chapter 18 of my book that deals with heaven world, which we've discussed already today. Okay, so that's my case why I think Christianity certainly can't live comfortably with the doctrine of original sin, but I think it also can't live without the doctrine either. And my reasoning goes as follows. Original sin is something that Christians believe broke the world. Remember, God created it perfectly, and human, through Adam and Eve eating the fruit, broke that perfect world. Jesus is too. Jesus' incarnation, passion, death, and resurrection provided the only way to fix this broken world. 3, Jesus' incarnation, passion, death, and resurrection constitute the necessary core of Christianity. 4, thus, if there were no original sin, there'd be no need for Jesus' incarnation, passion, death, and resurrection. That is, no need for Christianity. But obviously, Christians do hold that there is a need for Christianity. Therefore, Christianity can't live without the doctrine of original sin. And I close by repeating a phrase that one hears in the early church fathers from time to time when they're discussing the idea of the original sin of Adam and Eve. They use the phrase, "O felix culpa," which translates as "O happy flaw" or "O happy fault," and it's the sense of it is that this is a happy flaw or fault because it allowed the second person of the Trinity to take on flesh and come into this world, and for God to show his love and compassion for us by rescuing us and reinstating us in his good favor. So that's one reason why I think it would be difficult for Christianity to live without the doctrine of original sin. And that is my finish.
All right, awesome. So, yeah, I think by way of response, I'll start with what the last thing you said. So that we can't live without the doctrine. Now, a lot of your points, I'll bring it back up. I actually agree with. I think all 6 of them, right? But here's the problem that I would say that I think you're making is you're conflating the doctrine of the fall, with original sin doctrine, and I don't think those are the same things, right? So original sin, when I hear the doctrine of original sin, it has this element of, your last point about collective guilt, right? Like I'm born guilty of a sin, of committing a sin, just by virtue of inheriting. I inherit sin, kind of thing, right? I don't believe that aspect. The Eastern Orthodox, from my understanding, don't believe that either. Although it's interesting, they have a doctrine called the ancestral sin. So I might need to, maybe they're misrepresenting something. I need to talk to my contacts there. But what I would deny is that there's guilt. I think what we do is that, yes, they sinned. The world was broken. So we now live in a fallen, sinful world. We're born into that. And we inherit a sin nature, which without the enablement of the Holy Spirit would make it impossible for us to choose God and have the ability to choose the good over evil. We would, without the help of the Holy Spirit, we would just be in hell, literally, kind of thing, right? We would constantly choose evil. So I agree with you up to that point, but the part when I hear original sin, you're tacking on the collective guilt. Like I'm born guilty of a sin, and I don't believe that. Yeah, anything to say about that?
Can I jump in there, or do you want to finish off?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think you're right in the sense that the Catholic Church, and I think the Orthodox too, try to make the point that no, the guilt is not imputed to Adam and Eve. What is they don't help themselves out, because what they then turn around and say is no, they're not guilty of Adam and Eve's sin, but they are. It is perfectly acceptable to punish them for it. And that, of course, doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. If they're not guilty of it, then how come they get punished? That seems to be just as unfair. And with respect to confusing the original sin and the fall, I think you're right. You shouldn't do that. The original sin, I would say, led to the fall. They aren't the same things. They aren't equivalent. Those are just the 2 points of clarification that I want to make.
Yep, that's a good. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I should have said that, phrased it better. Yeah, so I would agree with you that I think it's immoral to make me guilty of the specific sin that Adam and Eve did. No, they did that. They deserve the punishment. Now, I do sometimes the fall, for example, is a consequence of Adam's sin, and I am born into this fallen world, but that's not the same as me being punished for him. So if you can recognize that, right? Like I'm not going to pay in hell for listening to Satan and eating a fruit in rebellion against God. No, only Adam and Eve will be being punished in hell for that mistake, that sin.
Yeah, except that if we're playing with one hand tied behind our back because of Adam and Eve, we have a corrupted nature which inclines us to sin, and that's like, again, being back in the park where you're trying to protect your children from the lion, but you can't use your trigger finger or something like that, and that doesn't seem to make sense. So yeah, we're sentenced to hell if we go to hell because of what we do, but the conditions that lead us to make decisions to act against God's will and so on are apparently enhanced by the fact that we have this kind of corrupted will. And once again, we've talked about this a number of times. I can definitely tell you that I have seen reference to the fact that the Catholic Church explicitly says if somebody dies and they are not baptized, then they can't go to heaven. And I have also something from an Eastern Orthodox diocese that says something similar. If that is the case, then again, we've got problems here. That somehow or other, Adam and Eve's sin causes a good deal of think of how in the world's population of 117 billion who were born alive, and then 418 billion who were conceived and who are persons, how many of them got baptized, just as a starter? Very small percentage. And if baptism is a necessary condition, then, Houston, we got problems, But anyway, okay.
As a Protestant, I think I would agree with that. If now I know the Catholic Church, they have exceptions or something like that to the general rule, but like you said, yeah, like if you're an unbaptized infant, you go into this limbo phase, I guess, or something like that, which you're not getting the full benefit. And I agree with you. I think that's immoral. If that's the Roman Catholic doctrine on that, then I would agree that that's unjustified and stuff like that. Okay, well, another point
let me just add something to that, because I think it's pertinent here. It's interesting that the Catholic Church is really tiptoeing around all of this, because on the one hand, they feel that they are historically having to commit to the fact that baptism is a necessary requirement. But as you suggested, they slip in a couple of exceptions. They talk about baptism of desire and baptism of blood, and the latter referred to people who had in the ancient period who had sort of become Christians but hadn't yet been baptized and then died as martyrs. Yeah. And so the fact that they shed their blood for their faith, that's the baptism of blood. And the baptism of desire is something like if you're a catechumen and you're studying to become a Christian in the ancient period, but you didn't quite finish and died before then, but your intention was, that's a baptism of desire. But that's only covers a very small percentage. The idea of limbo, apparently the Catholics, it was sort of an unofficial doctrine. It was never formally accepted. And in the middle part of the 20th century, maybe the 3/4 of the way in the 20th century, they made it clear that they weren't saying that there was a place called limbo, but they were saying that it's you can believe it, but we're not affirming it, and that somehow or other we entrust these souls to the mercy of God, and we can hope that they actually get to go to heaven, but we can't say that they, and they go on like that. And from my point of view, even as an ex-Catholic, I'm saying, come on. I mean, either say it or don't say it. It just seems like they're doing everything they can to pettifog the whole situation, and it's very unsatisfying, I think, in the long run. Okay, I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. You're entitled to at least a couple rants. So there you go. So, okay, well, here's something that, even though I'm not a Roman Catholic, I don't believe in original sin. I do agree with you. And so you're one of your moral critiques is that, yeah, but even under my view, you are born handicapped. You've got this sin. You do inherit a sin nature. You don't inherit sin, but a sin nature. And that handicaps you, right? It makes it impossible for you as a natural man not to sin or not to rebel against God in some way. And I would agree with that, but there is an answer. So I'm curious as to your answer to this. It's not immoral because God, that's sort of that's a necessary consequence of sinning, kind of thing, right? So it's not like, oh, this is a punishment. This is just the necessary consequence of when you sin, your offspring will inherit that trait because they will be born into a fallen world. Everything's corrupted and stuff like that. But if God, in terms of God being immoral, God gives the Holy Spirit, and that even works with unbelievers to enable them if they're willing. So long as they're willing to cooperate with the Holy Spirit, stuff like that, it enables them to at least get to a sufficient degree to make that choice to cooperate and meet the conditions or not. So do you think that would resolve it? There is this notion of Holy Spirit enablement, even with unbelievers, that allows them to make that choice.
Yeah, I've got 2 points on this. I hope I can remember them. The first one is that, what you're referring to, I take it, is general revelation, that just because you were born in the year 1700 BCE, that doesn't mean you can claim that you're ignorant of God and morality and maybe other aspects of what you need to do to please him and so on, because Paul talks about this, I guess, explicitly, and says that all people have, in effect, got this natural ability to reflect on nature and see its orderliness and awesomeness and beauty and complexity and so on, and recognize that the Christian God is ultimately behind it. And then the second part of general revelation has to do with the working of the Holy Spirit in our hearts, essentially telling us what's moral and immoral, and giving us other sort of things, so that basically nobody can claim that ignorance is a way out of the problem that they have. And my response to that, and I think I did put it in chapter 1, is I have grave reservations about whether general revelation is a thing, and it's got problems associated with it. The other thing, the point related, is that this doesn't really solve the entire problem, because we've got still those 301 billion who die in utero, for example, and general revelation is not going to be working on them at all. And how is it that without original sin that they should be considered sinful? I mean, Paul says we all sin. Well, clearly the ones who die in utero didn't sin, and yet they are somehow still considered sinful. Well, then you suggested, and a good God, it sounds like this would do something like that. I think you suggested that, well, God would take them under his wing and recognize that that they didn't have the opportunity to do it, and give them benefit of the doubt, and they're all saved. Well, then, as I mentioned earlier in this talk that we've had today, then the unfairness works in the opposite direction. The 301 billion are not the ones that are unfairly treated. It's the 117 billion who are born who are unfairly treated, because the 301 billion who are not born automatically get saved, whereas the 117 billion, they may not. Depends on how things play out, and that seems to be unfair.
Gotcha. Yep. I would agree if that's and that's why I go with the age of accountability. They will be saved, kind of thing, if they die in the womb. But I have 3 points, but I just want to go back to that point because I wasn't really talking about general revelation there. What I was trying to say is that the Holy Spirit corrects to varying degrees, but to a sufficient degree in everyone, even unbelievers, their ability to say yes or no kind of thing to God or the gospel, whatever way is appropriate for them to respond in their circumstances. They're not doomed to just reject God in whatever form because of the sin nature. So what I was trying to say is that the Holy Spirit offsets the negative impact of the fall. And if that's the case, would that take away your moral objection of saying, well, hey, look, it's not our fault. Thanks to what Adam and Eve did, we're all born with this sin nature kind of thing. That's what I was responding to.
In other words, would I be interpreting you correctly to say that, for example, the Holy Spirit working in the 12th century in Mexico, he would work Aztecally among the Aztecs to somehow or other, in their own context, in a way they could understand, have enough knowledge and so on to act morally and within God's purview, what God wants them to do. Is that the kind of idea that you're suggesting?
Yeah, exactly. Because that's one of the roles, right? The Holy Spirit convicts us of our moral conscience, that there is good and evil and stuff. This is what one of the roles that the Holy Spirit has, even for unbelievers and stuff like that. It says so. Well,
as they say, the devil is in the details, and a lot would have to be parsed there. On first glance, prima facie, to me, it doesn't sound like it would be easy to defend that view, but I think I understand what you're saying.
Fair enough. Okay. And sorry, Leslie, if it is true, pretend we went through that and I did convince you, would that solve your moral problem about the inheriting of a sin nature, though?
I'm not trying to be clever and avoid you here, but I'd have to read it and reflect on it. I think it's such an important point, and it's not something that I can sit here and say for certain what I would do without taking the time to, as I say, understand it and then reflect on it.
Fair enough. Yeah. Okay. So the second of three things that I just wanted to say about your case. So you mentioned something that God's immoral because Adam and Eve lacked the proper knowledge. They lacked the knowledge of the difference between good and evil. So therefore, they didn't really sin at all when they did. They're just like children. And you had a similar point about outwitting Satan. So I just want to say, I think the response there is that no, they did have a sufficient knowledge between the difference of good and evil. But what was sufficient for that? It's propositional knowledge. That's the same knowledge that God has as out of omniscience. He has propositional knowledge of the difference between good and evil. But God himself lacks experiential knowledge, contrastive experiential knowledge of the difference between good and evil. And that's what I would say Adam and Eve lacked, and they gained only upon sinning, right? They had experiential knowledge of what it is to do good. And once they sinned, they gained experiential knowledge, that contrast between good actions and evil actions, or righteousness versus sinful actions. And that's the knowledge that they had. But they had a sufficient propositional knowledge to understand good is good, don't do bad, just like God does. He's never sinned. He's never experienced that. But he knows propositionally the difference.
Well, I agree with you to a certain extent. Certainly, and one could come back and say, in opposition to what I argued, that the text makes it clear that they knew that God told them, don't do this. And they understood what don't do this means, because it means they're going to die the very day. And by the way, let's not get started on how Lucifer actually was telling the truth in that regard. And it seems like God wasn't. They didn't die that very day. Oh, but die. We're not talking about that day. We're talking about the spiritual. I don't want to go there. Anyway, so so they did know that. They know that God said don't do it. Just like a 3-year-old knows mommy said don't eat the chocolate chip cookie. But I guess the more important point is, does the 3-year-old know what it means to what's built into the don't? It's not just mommy saying this. It's what you should be doing in order to be an upright moral person. That's way above the head of a 3-year-old. And I'm thinking something like that might be applicable to Adam and Eve. They certainly knew that God didn't want them to do that. But another thing too, Dale, that I think is relevant is that they were in some sense, well, not in some sense, they were lied to by the serpent, in a sense. The serpent basically told them, it's fine, you're not going to die. God's not going to be essentially not going to be upset. And what do they know? This talking serpent sounds pretty good, and he's not bad mouthing God or anything like that. Just saying, go ahead, eat it. So in that sense, they're almost being entrapped. They bought the lie of this serpent. One can say, well, they shouldn't have. They should have gone to God and said, hey, the serpent said this. Is that true? But they're not the brightest bulbs on the porch at this point, and they don't do that, etc. But is all of that, does that add up to moral a moral deficiency or not? I don't know I don't think it does.
I think, yeah. So I think last thing before I go to my last point is I would agree with you if Adam and Eve were the equivalent of a 3-year-old, right? A 3-year-old, by definition, even your definition is, he's not at the age of accountability. Adam and Eve, even though they were, new creations, they had full maturity. They were fully adults in terms of their rational faculties and moral consciences. They're not the equivalent of a 3-year-old. Everything was sufficient. Their knowledge base and everything was sufficient, I think, according to the story, to make that choice, a proper choice between good and evil, and they chose the evil, and that's why God made them responsible. Whereas if they were literally equivalent to a 3-year-old, they didn't have a fully developed moral conscience or fully developed reasoning faculties and stuff like that. So that's the only difference, I think, I would say. Yep. Okay. And my third and final rebuke is one that, so I agree with your argument on this.
Rebuke. Oh, hey.
Objection.
Dale's getting funky here now.
Objection, whatever you want to call it.
I know where you live, Schoenig.
All right. So, and this is one that I would be on your side about, but for the sake of argument, I want to get your response because you have this burden of proof. You said that collective punishment is unjustified as this kind of absolute statement, but clearly we have examples where we do collective punishments, or we punish innocent people for the sins of others all the time. In law, it's called vicarious liability. Why should an innocent CEO have to be punished for the crimes of their employees? Or, if a janitor forgets to mop up a wet floor and someone slips, why are we suing the hotel manager? He didn't do anything wrong. So how would you respond to someone who says, well, there's nothing unjustified about corporate punishment. We do it all the time. It's a good thing. It's the right thing to do.
I remember reading about this, and unfortunately I can't remember what the response was, but let me think about it just briefly here. I think, of course, the reason we do it with respect to law is because we want to encourage those who are in managerial positions to exert the greatest amount of caution and prudence in things that could be dangerous. And this is the only efficient way we can do this, because we humans are imperfect and so forth, and we can't figure out a better way to do it. And so it's the least worst of all the options that we have. God, on the other hand, is not going to be restricted by that. He's got perfect knowledge and power and goodness and so on, and clearly he doesn't have to try to achieve those ends in that rather brutal and crude way. He could do it in other ways that would be much more in line with justice. Why not just punish Adam and Eve? I mean, where is it? Why would he have to think, okay, now everybody's going to suffer and die? I just find that very difficult to understand and accept.
Yeah, for what it's worth, as I said, I totally agree. Right, in law, the reason why we have vicarious liability is it's because we have practical limitations, and there are practical stakes. Maximally just being, he doesn't have those limitations. He would only punish the guilty. So I fully agree with you. But yeah, thank you for. Just want to say thank you so much for coming on, and I'm so sorry we went over time, but thank you for sticking with me and stuff like that. It was a great conversation and everything. I hope you enjoyed your time as well.
It was a hoot. It was a hoot. I want to tell you, I'm impressed because you are not, so far as I understand it, a sort of professionally trained apologist in the way that perhaps William Lane Craig or other such stellar figures are. But this has become apparently for you a labor of love, and it's of utmost importance. And you have done a lot of work, I can see, to inform the positions that you have, and you're continuing to do work on it. And I listened to some of your podcast, especially when you were starting in the session on the resurrection. And honestly, I got a little sad because I know you put a lot of work into it, and the viewership wasn't great in terms of numbers, and then you even got a little bit of headwind from your church, and I thought, this guy is. He's got a talent here, and he's working really hard. And I don't think what do they say? A prophet is not appreciated in his own land. I don't want to say that you're a prophet, but somebody like yourself with a good idea and working hard, I would have hoped it would have been more well received. And I just want to say I respect what you do and how much you know about these things, even though you may not have letters after your name. It shows that if you have love and you have persistence and a drive, and in your case, you might say the Holy Spirit in your sales, you can do a lot, and you've done that. So kudos to you.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much. That really means a lot to me. I believe in what I believe. I want to share that knowledge with people and give them the best opportunity. As I said, I went through, I don't know how much you know about me, but I went through my own period as a unbeliever, I think for about 8 years, where I was doing my religious research. I lost my faith in Christianity, and I wanted to study the religions and the evidences and reasons for it. So I did my best that I could to figure out what the truth is. And here I am. So I like to share what I know and my reasoning, why am I believing what I believe right now, kind of thing, and get responses from people. So it was a shame. That Bible study was important, kind of thing, but they weren't ready for it. But I would say that thankfully at another church, Oakwood Wesleyan Church, they were interested. So I have been off and on kind of teaching a Bible course on the Shroud for them. So thankfully, that's working out. But thank you so much. I appreciated that. Awesome. So yeah, you're welcome back anytime on the show. Any topic you want, we could, we don't have to do as many topics. We could restrict it and stuff like that to 2 or something topics, whatever you want to do. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you? Yeah, I'm going to contact you at some point. I'm working on an atheological argument, an argument to try to disprove the existence of God that I think is quite novel, and I'd love to have another pair of intelligent eyes on it, especially someone who at least initially should not be inclined to let me get away with anything. And if I could email you that and then have you look it over and it's not terribly long. So, I mean, we're not talking about, and it's nothing in it that's terribly complex that you're going to have to look up research. It's pretty sane, but I'd love to get your take on it, and maybe help me to see where I've made my mistakes or not.
Absolutely. Yeah. Send that. I'd be glad to help you out. No problem. So,
okay, good. I'll do that then.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, that does it. I see in the audience, thank you to Chris Lucas and Ringo Cat. Ringo Cat, love the show. Thank you guys. Really good show. Take care and God bless. And just so everyone knows, so this isn't my only podcast today. I've got to do it all over again at 7:00 tonight with Phil Bear. We're going to be reviewing my debate with Catholic Louis Dizon, this time on the Eucharist as opposed to the baptism debate. So I'll see you guys in a few hours. But other than that, have a great week, guys, and take care, Richard.
Okay, thank you.